Councilor. We are here today regarding Docket 0136, order for a hearing regarding pension fund disclosures, socially responsible investment and reinvestment. I'd like to remind folks this is a public hearing being broadcast and taped on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV. I'd ask folks in the chamber to silence your electronic devices. At the conclusion of presentations from the panels, and maybe in between some of the panels, we'll take some public testimony. There is sign-in sheets off to my left by the door. We ask that you sign in, state name, any affiliation, and address, and please state your name before your testimony. I'd also like to say that we also accept testimony in writing through email or snail mail, ccc.wm@boston.gov. I'd also like to ask folks that we'd ask you to refrain from any public displays of approval or non-approval. This seems to be a long hearing today. I may have to excuse myself at some point later today. And I'd also like to introduce my colleagues in order of their arrival, and I'll start with the sponsors. Councilor Lydia Edwards to my right, to my left, Councilor Michelle Wu, and then in order of arrival, Councilor Kim Janey, Councilor Tim McCarthy, Councilor Ed Flynn, Councilor Matt O'Malley, and Councilor Frank Baker. I'm sorry? And, I'm sorry, and I want to acknowledge that Councilor Matt O'Malley is also a co-sponsor on this, this hearing. Again, I would like to welcome the panel. We have brief opening statements from the two sponsors, the three sponsors. I would ask if anybody else would waive that opportunity so we can get right into it. But let me first recognize Councilor Lydia Edwards.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of the advocates and community members for being here today. Today we're here to discuss the city's fiduciary responsibilities and social responsibilities. We are outright dismissing the idea that they are incompatible and to create mechanisms for investing in accordance with our values. Boston has a long history of activism in this area with Councilor Yancey, Mayor Flynn, Representative Mel King, all fighting for divestment from apartheid and bringing that message across the country. I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of this hearing order with two colleagues who have taken already made attention and taken action to this issue in the past with regard to sustainability. Additionally, our committee chairman and representatives of the Retirement Board are here today and have played critical roles over the years in watching our benefits, payments, and pension liability for retirees. I thank you for that work. Today's discussions need to start with regular disclosure and open dialogue of where our money is and the standards that we use when determining how we're going to invest it. In some cases, and with some public funds, we have ample discretion. With the pension fund, we have more restrictions, but can do a deep analysis of investments and move toward policies that allow us to invest responsibly and sustainably while protecting the bottom line. Transparency is extremely important, but it is not the end goal in and of itself. So let me be very clear. I do believe, quite firmly, the city should not be investing in fossil fuels. We should not be investing in private prisons. We should not be invested in weapons. We should not be invested in predatory student loan companies. We, however, should be investing in our communities, and we should be investing in a socially just economy. It's also important to make a distinction between ethical investment in national and global publicly traded corporations and deploying funds that meet the needs of our neighborhoods and community businesses. I'm happy to see us take a small step in the right direction with discretion of investments in community banks, which increases lending opportunity. Before my time on the councils, members such as Councilor Arroyo in 2013 pushed for the community banking and standards on investment. That resulted in the Municipal and Community Reinvestment Commission being established and authorized in Section 6.8 of the city ordinances. So there has been work, and it's been clear the city has been able to set standards for community banking and for reinvestment beforehand. It's certainly time to look at reactivating or reinventing that kind of stakeholder group to account for the concerns and the kinds of community investment opportunities we will discuss today. We need to go further, and one of the panels today will discuss creative economic development strategies that keep money in our communities. As we talk about responsible investment, I want to mention that stakeholder activism also has its place and its limits. It may help us win disclosure from companies like Exxon about lying to the public on climate change, but it won't reduce the temperature of the atmosphere or stop abuses in the criminal justice system. We are pledging to be carbon neutral, but we have millions invested in carbon pollution. We don't count the impact of these dollars on our climate action plan. We're trying to protect retirees, but we have a shortage of senior housing. We're struggling to make these buildings resilient to heat or to resist storms. Just like Mayor Flynn took up the cause in South Africa, mayors in New York City and London have taken to divesting from fossil fuels. When we recall about Boston's role in fighting apartheid, can we think about taking a leadership role today? We've done this before. Can we go a step further by not simply asking what we should not do, but asking residents where our money should go? I'm excited for this hearing. We've heard an announcement this morning, actually, about $150 million. And I look forward to discussing how we can work together to set standards for that $150 million investment, but more importantly, to look at the $5 or $6 billion we have in our pension and make sure that all of that is also set to a morally just standard as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to remind my colleagues that when we get into the question and answer period, I will be holding to a 5-minute hard stop. And for public testimony will be a 3-minute hard stop. There's a lot of folks who signed up. Councilor Wu.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief, just to thank all of our panelists who are before us now and will be joining us, and the advocates in the room, and particularly my colleagues who are pushing this issue. We are at a crossroads as a society right now around income inequality and racial disparities and climate change, and the urgency to act could not be greater. And so given that there's a vacuum in federal leadership, given that there's delays at the state level, every municipality has the obligation to take whatever steps that we can to move forward in closing these gaps. And I would just add that here, what we learned in our last round when Councilor Malley and I were focusing on the angle of fossil fuel divestment for the city several years ago was that we are at the place now where that is there's not a choice between the financial health of our investments and the social justice and moral compass of our values. That the choices we're faced with now are about the investment vehicles and mechanisms that end up in some ways doing better, and particularly with the risk that fossil fuels present, it will be smarter for our retirees if we move in this direction. So I just want to thank the co-sponsors and all my colleagues for being here. This is what we should be doing with every aspect of the city's, not just policies, but our purchasing power and our power of the purse as well, putting our money where our mouth is. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to my dear colleague and friends, the co-sponsors on this very important hearing order. Councilors Wu and Edwards, appreciate your leadership and partnership on this. Thank you, most importantly, the men and women who have joined us in this room and others that have offered testimony. And thank you to the panel, of course. Look forward to getting into questions. As we discuss Docket 0136, an order for hearing regarding pension fund disclosure, socially responsible investment and reinvestment, it's important that our money reflects the value of our city, and that means no to prisons, no to for-profit predatory lenders, no to manufacturers of weapons, and no to the fossil fuel industry. Now, I've often said that every fiscal conservative ought to be an environmentalist, because we have seen time and time again, we're now up to nearly $6 trillion that has been taken out of fossil fuel, divested from oil and natural gas industries, and those portfolios are performing at much higher, much better rates. They're getting a better return on investment moving away from fossil fuels. An overwhelming majority of top investors in the U.S. renewable energy sector say that they will double their cumulative investments between now and 2030, according to nonpartisan survey by the American Council for Renewable Energy. According to McKinsey & Company, 77% of new global electrical generation capacity from now until 2050 will come from wind and solar. There's a growing global market. We've seen China spending $126.6 billion, followed by the United States at $40 billion. China is nearly quintupling, certainly quadrupling what our investment is in clean energy. It is high time that we defund and denounce the industry that contributes the most to climate change, that funds climate denial, and prevents climate action. Let's get to work.
Thank you. I will hand it now to the panel.
Thank you, Chairman Steele, Councilors Edwards, Wu, and O'Malley, and members of the Boston City Council. I'm going to start today with some well-worn points that you've heard me highlight before. You've heard me talk about these points before because they are critical for our ability to invest in our city, and they're also a very important backdrop to our discussion today. Together, Mayor Walsh and this council have balanced strong fiscal management practices with making sustainable investments in our city, our neighborhoods, and our people. This commitment to sound fiscal management has been affirmed 5 years in a row by Moody's and S&P, who are our rating agencies, through AAA bond ratings. As recently as this month, the city's management practices and deliberate long-term planning were credited by both raters, once again giving us the highest rating possible. Our continued commitment to aggressively paying down our unfunded pension liability is something that differentiates us from other state and local governments, and that the rating agencies have highlighted as a credit positive for the City of Boston. More direct than a good report card for the city, the pension funding commitments we've made have a direct impact on our retirees, current and future. We are committed to providing the defined benefit that our employees have worked towards for many, many years. As of our last valuation, the average retiree benefit was just less than $3,000 a month and about $35,000 a year. Fully funding our liability will not only ensure that we can provide these benefits as estimated today, but it will allow us to consider adjustments to benefits to react to changes in cost of living. Yesterday, the City of Leominster was in the news for reaching full funding of their pension liability. With that milestone, their retirement system has committed to a cost of living adjustment for their retirees, the first one in many years. Here in Boston, the Boston Municipal Research Bureau has recommended and advised the city to not pursue cost of living adjustments until we are 80% funded. Now that's just a recommendation, but as of our last valuation, we were 77% funded. So making meaningful progress in our funded ratio through the city contributions in the annual budget and also market returns is critical to that conversation here. The funds that we are here today to discuss have a primary purpose. Most of these funds support the commitments we've made to our current and future City of Boston retirees. Some support the mission and obligation of the city's trust funds, which include annual support for our health clinics and public art projects via the White Fund and the Brown Fund, to name a few examples out of the thousands of trusts. And some support the essential day-to-day operations of the City of Boston. Payroll for everyone from first responders to lunch monitors, payments to vendors to plow our snow and pick up our garbage, and grants to local nonprofits and community organizations. In a way, these three areas span the whole of our responsibilities as a city, and these funds allow us to make good on our commitments to our residents, our taxpayers, and our employees. These funds also represent an opportunity for the city. As we ensure that the critical primary function of these funds is achieved, the existence of these resources also allows us to think about how they can be leveraged and utilized to support the values that are core to our city, the mayor, and this council. I would like to focus my remarks, and I will be brief after this, on what the city has done within the limits of state law and guided by our responsibilities to leverage available funds to further our values. But before that, it's important to be clear that the City of Boston does not directly own any fossil fuel companies, private prisons, or gun manufacturers, and the Boston Retirement Board does not directly own any private prisons or gun manufacturers. Both the City of Boston and the Retirement Board exercise environmental, social, and governance, or ESG screens via our investment managers when considering investments. And recently, we've implemented initiatives that will enable us to make sustainable, activist investments while maintaining our strong financial management practices. I'll let others on this panel talk more in detail about them, but we've recently joined the Ceres Investor Network, which is a sustainability nonprofit that works with institutional investors to promote socially responsible corporate action. We have signed on to participate in C40 Network's Invest and Divest Forum, and we are making proactive investments in local community banks and companies, as the councilor alluded to, and also companies with strong environmental, social, and governance practices. We are committed to exploring other further strategies while being intentional about our investment decisions and their impacts. Additionally, the mayor remains committed to making proactive investments in programs and policies that have a nexus with many of the issues highlighted at today's hearing. These investments are within the framework of our long-term plan and have been addressed, have been out in front in addressing future needs and challenges of our city. You're all familiar with the Climate Ready Boston initiative and our September 2018 commitment to pledge at least 10% of all new capital spending to climate resiliency projects, as well as consideration of how the city may become climate neutral. The mayor's 2019-2020 legislative agenda contained several bills on addressing gun safety. We have created the Office of Returning Citizens in 2017, which works to support nearly 3,000 individuals who returned to Boston after being released from incarceration. And in 2014, the mayor launched Operation Exit, which also focuses on young people returning from incarceration to give them a second chance in improving their lives. With that, I'd like to thank the council for your partnership and leadership in the conversation and about how the city considers our values while investing the resources that are entrusted to us. I will turn it over to Tim Smith first, who will provide additional testimony specifically on the Boston retirement system, and then Drew Smith to talk about the city's treasury funds.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Timothy Smith. I have the great privilege of being the executive officer at the Boston Retirement System. I'm joined today by Mike Manning, our investment consultant from NEPC, as well as Will Ford from NEPC. John Kelly is a systems investment analyst, and Ellen McCarthy is a systems comptroller. The Boston Retirement System is a multi-employer defined benefit plan that serves employees of the City of Boston, Boston Housing Authority, Boston Planning and Development Agency, Boston Water and Sewer Commission, Boston Public Health Commission, as well as some Suffolk County Sheriff's Departments, retirees and beneficiaries. As of January 1st, 2018, our last valuation, our system consisted of 14,448 retirees and beneficiaries, 20,995 active members, and 10,623 inactive members. Those are people that still have money in the system but may not work for the Boston anymore. That totals 46,066 people who are considered members or retirees of our system. These figures include teachers who are actually the liability of the Commonwealth, but nonetheless remain members of the Boston Retirement System after their transfer in 2010. The average monthly retirement benefit, excluding Boston school teachers, was $2,952. The average age of retirees and beneficiaries was 73.8 years. During calendar year 2018, we issued retirement benefits in the amount of $613,483,260. So it's over $613 million. This is an average of over $51 million per month. To demonstrate the constant pressure on the retirement system, our yearly pension payroll has risen from over $515 million just in 2013 up to last year's over $613 million. Dating back to 2013, we averaged 681 new retirees and survivor beneficiaries each year. For over 15 years, NEPC has been the system's investment consultant. Employee-owned, NEPC is one of the industry's largest independent full-service investment consulting firms in the United States. It has over 40 public fund clients. NEPC's collective client base has outperformed the Investor Force ICC median in 27 of 32 years since its founding in 1986. Our lead contact at NEPC is Michael Manning. Mr. Manning is the managing partner at NEPC. He started his investing career in 1993 after attaining his MBA at the University of Chicago. He also received his BA from the University of Notre Dame. Mr. Manning is a member of the Boston Security Analyst Society and CFA Institute. He is a CFA charter holder, and he also holds a Chartered Alternative Investment Analyst designee in 2005. Additionally, there are 4 other dedicated team members assisting the system from NEPC and over 50 people from NEPC's research team that we leverage in making investment decisions. As of January 1st, 2018, the market value of the system's investment portfolio was over $5 billion. This figure does not include $1.7 billion which is attributable to the Boston school teachers that is being invested by the Pension Reserves Investment Management Board, commonly known as PRIM. As of January 1st, 2018, our funded percentage on a market value basis was 77.43%. Our funded ratio was among the top 1/5 of our peers in Massachusetts. We are targeting a fully funded date of 2025, which is earlier than most other systems in the Commonwealth. Our investment return history between 1985 and 2017 is 9.06%. The portfolio's assumed rate of return is currently 7.5%. The assumed rate of return is the target return for our investments. Investment return rates become more volatile as we approach fully funding, which is the case here. When not meeting the return assumption, there are fewer years to spread the losses over which could create significantly higher payments from the city in order to make up those losses and possibly adversely impacting the city's bond rating. Investment decisions for the portfolio are made by a 5-member board. The board members are obligated to discharge their duties solely in the interests of members and beneficiaries and for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits and defraying reasonable expenses of administering the system. It is worthy of note, as Emma stated, the system does not directly hold any traditional gun manufacturers or private prisons. The system recognizes the dangers of climate change and has invested millions of dollars into funds that make renewable energy investments. One of our investment managers, ArcLight, is one of the largest renewable investors in the world, investing over $3.1 billion of their capital in renewable projects since its inception, including developing the largest wind project ever built in the United States. As a limited partner, we have invested in projects and companies such as Leeward Renewable Energy, LLC, with a portfolio of 18 wind projects in western, central, mid-Atlantic, and southern United States, as well as the Great River Hydro, with a portfolio of 13 hydroelectric plants in New England. The system remains committed to renewable energy investments and will be conducting a search to make another investment in that space later this year. ESG is part of the system's manager selection process. ESG is incorporated within our investment consultant, NEPC's, broader due diligence process as they evaluate not only investment firms, but also their investment strategies. Specific to the system, NEPC also rates all search candidates on an overall scale of 1 to 4 based on suitability, which also incorporates ESG. Thus far, I've thrown a lot of figures at you. However, I don't see them as numbers, I see them as people. To me, they are the 40-year City Hall employee who is naturally anxious about retiring and living on a fixed income. The employee involved in a car accident while working, injuring herself so badly she cannot return to work. The employees dying of cancer that we visit in the hospital, and when you show what the benefit will be to their beneficiaries, you can see the relief on their face. And the widow whose husband won't be returning from home because he was killed in line of duty. These are not anecdotes. They're actual cases I've been involved with during my time at the Retirement Board. Without overstating the reality, the system is the single most important agency in City Hall as to the welfare and well-being of city employees and their beneficiaries. We provide benefits that allow our members and beneficiaries dignity in their retirement years, and for many, a financial lifeline. And with that, I would introduce Drew Smith from the Treasury Department.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me, councilors. I'm joined today by Maureen Garceau, who is our Director of Accounts Receivable for the city, and Richard DiPiano, who's the city's second Assistant Collector Treasurer. As I said, I'm Drew Smith, and I serve as Head of Treasury for the city. As it relates to the issues before us, the Treasury Department generally operates in 2 capacities. In the first capacity, the department manages the standard functions that any governmental treasury would. We accept revenues, which are our operational funds. We hold those funds safe until they are expended and make payments to the city's employees and vendors with them. On an annual budget of more than $3 billion, it will certainly come as no surprise that these sums can become substantial. In fact, the city maintains an average balance of around $1.5 billion in these accounts right now. While we manage the daily flow of funds into and out of these accounts, we invest the monies to generate a positive, but as near riskless as possible return as we can until the funds are needed to pay bills. While Treasury does maintain a certain amount of discretion in how these funds are invested, because of their essentiality to the continued operation of government, we operate within a fairly strict set of constraints determined by the Commonwealth. Fortunately, the city is given additional flexibility above and beyond what other cities and towns are given, and we are allowed the opportunity to invest in securities, the same securities that the Commonwealth is able to invest in for generally the same purpose. Chief Handy and I have been at the city for about the same length of time. It's only been about a year and a few months. Interestingly, one of the first conversations that we had, and it's one that has continued, understanding the mayor's commitment to using any lever we have to proactively address issues that affect our community, that conversation was about determining a way to use the city's considerable assets to achieve, number one, its primary goal of safety, liquidity, and return, while still leveraging those assets to promote a broader good in the city and beyond. Continuing with the point that Chief Handy touched on earlier, we are pleased to announce that as a result of that first conversation and all the ones since, the city has just completed a full rewrite of its operating funds investment policy to provide for 2 new initiatives within the portfolio. While working within the constraints that the Commonwealth has set for us, with adoption of this new policy, the city is committing at least $100 million for deposit in local community banks and financial institutions. It is our hope that by helping to grow the assets of the banks right here in our backyard, that they are redeployed into small business and home lending right here in Boston. Secondly, the city is creating an ESG initiative within its cash investment portfolio and is committing up to $150 million to be invested in ultra-short-term, highly rated securities of companies that maintain high ESG scores. While this program will still take some time to ramp up, this is an important and major first step in using our resources to not only make responsible investments for our taxpayers, but to work toward a common good. The full policy can be found on the Treasury's website at boston.gov. So I had said that there were 2 capacities that the Treasury worked in. The second is particularly unique and is one of the best parts of my job, and that is management of the city's trust funds. Over the centuries, and it's always interesting because in Boston you get to say centuries, funds have been bequeathed by a number of our city's residents upon their passing to be governed in accordance with the terms of their wills. The most frequent provision of these trusts is that the original principal is invested to be held forever, with the income generated to be used for a benefit of Boston residents. Now, these purposes are generally nuanced by the specific interests that those passing along the money had. The Edward Ingersoll Brown Fund is an example, and a major funder of public art, providing approximately $800,000 annually for projects such as the memorial honoring Boston's own Kip Tiernan, a fighter for social justice. It is also funding the Boston Marathon Memorial, which is expected to be completed later this year. The George Robert White Fund owns and leases property to nonprofit clinics for $1 a year so that they can more affordably provide services to our residents. It also supports 2 community swimming pools, a children's zoo, and a daycare center. The George Parkman Fund alone contributes $1 million annually to the support, maintenance, and upkeep of the city's park system, and every quarter, the Treasury spends hours reviewing requests from small community groups asking assistance in providing funding for everything from sending many of our Boston's children with special needs to summer camps, to career training programs for disadvantaged populations, to community festivals, to Black History Month events. The largest of our trusts, the Other Post-Employment Benefits Trust, or OPEB, you'll hear us call it, is in place to provide continuing health care benefits for our retirees. Its investment and careful management will work to reduce pressure on the city's budget and free up resources for additional city services. Our obligation to make the best investment decisions we possibly can for these trusts, not only from the perspective of growing returns, but also from a perspective of preserving principle, stems not just from the binding legal and fiduciary obligations that we maintain, but also from our understanding of the important role that these trusts play in the civic life of the city, even if the sources of the funds are not frequently known. In an effort to maximize the returns of these trusts while doing what we can to limit the risk of loss, Treasury places a focus on diversification of these investments across multiple disciplines, sectors, and funds. As our trust assets have grown, we have consistently added new fund strategies within the portfolios in an effort to further diversify our holdings and safeguard against depletion of the principal. In a few cases, we are able to do this through separately managed accounts. These are accounts in which we employ a portfolio manager to manage the assets while the city technically maintains registered ownership and direct exposure to the underlying holdings. In these instances, the city often has additional flexibility to single out securities for purchase or exclusion. In the majority of cases, however, the city holds its assets in institutional funds, and these are essentially mutual funds in which we own participation units, but do not have the ability to dictate what holdings should stay in and which ones should be kept out. While it would certainly be the city's preference to maintain holdings exclusively in these separately managed accounts, in which we maintain full discretion, these accounts are generally more costly and require higher minimum investments. Considering the smaller size of the city's portfolio, it is best able to efficiently diversify its holdings and mitigate its risk through the use of institutional funds. With respect to the selection of new fund managers over the past year, Treasury has worked to put in place an enhanced diligence process. In addition to the ESG scoring matrix, our own pension managers, also NEPC, put in place, Treasury is now conducting in-person diligence visits with these managers, where we have also incorporated an ESG screen into our questions to determine face-to-face specifically how these portfolio managers view ESG investing. With respect to our trust investment holdings, and also as a result of the conversations that we have been having within the A&F cabinet for some time, Treasury is pleased to announce that this week the city has taken a huge step forward in the concept of investor and has integrated the concept of activist investor into our mission. Not only will the city be a corporate owner looking for a positive return, we will become an activist investor and will use the platform provided by Ceres, which is a Boston-based nonprofit, to do it. Through the Ceres Investor Network, the city will work alongside 165 other institutional investors representing over $25 trillion in assets to directly engage with companies in promoting strong ESG practices in all areas of their business. And I look around and I think a lot of the folks here today would agree that sometimes staying in the game and making noise is the only way to force change, and we couldn't agree more. And that's exactly what we plan on doing. And absolutely, investor activism has its limitations. But right now, it is the only approach that we're seeing has immediate impact to the situation. As I hope you will see, Treasury in every single line of business is committed to not only appropriately carrying out its core mission of safeguarding assets and limiting risk, but also to leveraging its significant resources to benefit our residents and promote a more sustainable world. And with that, I believe the panel is able to take questions.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to defer my initial questionings to one of the sponsors, Councilor Edwards.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for informing us. I think it's really important to have the rubric and understanding of the pots of money and how we invest. I know you initially touched on what we do and don't own, specifically and outright, but we are invested indirectly or directly in fossil fuels, correct?
Correct. So Boston Retirement System has some direct investments in fossil fuels, and both Treasury and BRS, and the experts here can correct me, both hold commingled funds, which may have some exposure to fossil fuels and other industries.
Could we get, at some point, and maybe not today, but at later on, an informed understanding of how much we have invested in fossil fuels? Also, in private prisons, we do indirectly have some investments in private prisons, is that correct?
So we can absolutely get you that data, Councillor. The investments that are managed through commingled funds, it is slightly harder to get sometimes clarity around exactly what's held at any given point. Obviously, we don't have ownership stake in those, and so those are held by someone else, and they make decisions about what's in the portfolio and what is not. However, we can get you the data that we have, and happy to talk questions about that. We have a very small exposure in BRS. Out of the $5 billion of assets, there's about
BRS?
Boston Retirement System, sorry. Perhaps about $100,000 related to for-profit prisons, and actually there's a very small exposure also within the library's resources that are managed in trust of about $8,000. And so those are things that we're actively looking at in terms of how can we sort of manage those out, but because they are part of this complex structure around commingled funds, it's much harder for us to have
Right.
the flexibility to
Yeah,
do
so
that.
I'm just walking through what,
Yep.
because you had mentioned, and I think we don't have direct ownership, but we do have indirect and some commingled investments. So far, $100,000 about, and maybe $8,000 in the library fund and in privately owned prisons. And we're going to get the number, I think, on fossil fuels. I'm sure it's pretty big.
Yep.
And
larger.
And I know, just looking at some of the managed account information I have, we have a lot, to my surprise, investment in student loans, right? So I say that only because I'm still, and I finally broke the 90s in terms of how much I owe in student debt, to
I'm
think
with
I'm
you.
paying on my student loans and know that also my retirement's invested in them. I feel like I'm paying myself ultimately in my retirement. So I'm just going to put that out there. I'm not bitter. Anyway, I'm not bitter. I'm moving on. So what I think what is really good about this hearing and that the forthrightness is really helping us to understand the systemic pressures that you are dealing with, but also the systemic opportunities that we have. That's why it's so important to talk about how the investment isn't just a pull in or pull out. It's a real moral statement about the system we want to maintain and sustain. So talking about those rules and regulations, if you can help us go a little deeper, I'm talking specifically to the pension folks, and then you can distinguish yourself on the city side. What is, in your basic understanding, the fiduciary duty of your job and those that maintain our pension, and where can we find that?
I have a copy of the board members' duties right here, if you'd like
Thank
a
you.
copy. It's quite long, but to boil it down, it's to maximize the returns for the sole benefit of the exclusive benefit of the members and beneficiaries.
And that rate of return is at 7.5%,
7.5.
to at least meet that.
Correct.
You would argue, I mean, just in layman terms, to meet that 7.5% on an annual basis and to fully fund, right, our retirement. And we are ahead of schedule, thank goodness, to do that.
The only thing I'd add to that is 7.5 is for the entire portfolio. There are some spaces where we probably have a higher expectation and some we have a lower expectation. And Mr. Manning could probably speak a little better to that.
Yeah, so I would also clarify that as much as you'd like to get it on an annual basis, it's really measured over a long-term horizon,
Understood.
understanding you're not going to get 7.5 every single year.
Every single year. So in those, that seems like a large, I would say it's a pretty decent amount of space to work with. Is there room for a specific SRI or standards to be set for investment?
Can you provide more clarity on the question?
What straining mechanisms can we put in with regards to socially responsible investments that we can put in directly in the pension?
Yeah, so, the pension is governed by the PAIR Act regulations in Chapter 32. And so any constraints or specific instructions would have to come through PAIR Act. Otherwise, it's designed to be solely for the beneficiaries of the pension plan. I mean, there is
The
as
board
part-
then, I'm sorry, just to be clear, the board could not come up with investment standards, the board members, the 5 board members you talked about.
Well, we have an investment policy,
Right.
but as Mr. Manning said, everything's approved by PARAC at the end of the day. Currently, there are 3 prohibitions in Chapter 32, which is essentially our part of general laws. That'd be South Africa, guns and munitions in South Africa, guns and munitions in Northern Ireland, and tobacco. So as far as prohibitions, or say we wanted to divest from fossil fuels, I would respectfully submit that we should probably go to the State House and have that reflected in an amendment to Chapter 32.
That's for the pension.
Right.
But for the city, could you address the fiduciary duties?
Sure.
What restraints you have and the room for the SRI?
Sure. So let me talk about the trust investments where we actually hold, traditional fixed income and equity investments. So the constraints applicable to the BRS, the Boston Retirement System, are generally set in statute. And because of that, they are also applicable to us. So those same constraints are something that the trust face. As far as fiduciary obligation, beyond that, the concept of a fiduciary obligation is a little bit tougher to nail down, and is generally something that is kind of defined by the courts through case law. Generally, that means you're trying to maximize your investment returns while limiting risk within whatever your investment target is. Our investment target for the biggest trust is the OPEB trust, and that's 6.75%. So that's on the That is on the trust side of things. Now, it's a little bit different on the cash side of things. So that is very, very strictly determined through statute. There is a listing of investments that we can't hold, and we can't hold anything else. And if you want to take a look at the cash investment policy, we actually have every single one of those listed out. So that gives everybody a pretty good list because there's about 8 to 10 of them. So those are the main constraints we have there. Any bank deposits, we need to have collateralized or insured and things like that, in addition to the securities that they have listed.
Okay, that's it for this round.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilor Wu.
Thank you very much. So just given I know I've had several meetings with you all and appreciate the time that you took the last go-round to talk to us about fossil fuel divestment as well. Has there been any research done or consideration between then and now in terms of the sort of financial attractiveness of fossil fuel divestment or sort of more responsible sustainability, more sustainable and morally responsible investment?
Mr. Manning can speak to that, but I would add that 2 retirement boards have tried to divest from fossil fuels.
In Massachusetts, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
And both were denied by PERAC on the basis of the fiduciary duty.
Which ones were they?
Somerville and Cambridge.
Okay,
And I can share these with you as well.
great.
Yeah, so maybe I'll touch on what we call ESG investment or guidelines, and that has become a much bigger part of the investment process, I think, for institutional and private investors in general. NEPC was one of the original consultant signatories on the UN, what was the UN PRI guidelines and is now PRI, and as part of that, we commit to making ESG part of our investment process. So we're not picking individual securities, but we're evaluating the managers. One of the things that we do is work with the managers to understand how important ESG or ESG factors are within the different strategies that they invest. And so that is part of our due diligence process, and that's certainly increased a lot over the last 4 or 5 years to the point where we now rate all new strategies on a 1 to 4 scale. Obviously, the ones that are actively incorporating ESG are more highly rated, and the ones that are ignoring it or not paying attention to it at all, I guess, are lowly rated. So that is certainly part of it.
And when you say so something internal about your internal strategy changed over the last few years,
Yeah.
especially, that was just based on votes of the board to adopt different policies, or is that so where did that decision change happen?
So that decision for NEPC to change or to adapt our investment process happened within our firm internally, obviously responding to client interests and demands to make that a bigger part of a more distinct part of it or intentional.
What do you mean by
part of it.
client demands? So by client, I guess.
So we work with 300 clients. There are a lot that are interested in making sure that the ESG factors are a big part of the investment process. And while it had always been there in terms of asking managers, we're asking the managers, are you asking the companies about how they're managing themselves? We've made it a more intentional and discrete part of our investment process to be able to communicate that back out to clients because it's taken on greater interest.
So it sounds like there is some space between changing state law and, sort of status quo. And I'm just trying to figure out exactly what the interplay is between clients requesting or kind of where that, to change the level of weight that ESG gets. So what kind of sparks that to go up?
Not sure I fully understand the question.
So you said that over the last few years, there have been changes to respond more to socially responsible investing or ESG standards anyway.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate that to continue? And does any action from the city and the retirement board accelerate or change your timelines for moving that up or down?
Yeah, so I think and our action was in response to general client demand. There are some clients, frankly, generally not ones governed by pension law or the same type of pension law that you have here in Massachusetts, that they can dictate more strongly particular ESG guidelines. So, for example, a family office or a particular endowment that has or foundation that has a specific mission. Oftentimes, they will have very explicit guidelines of which they're governed by. Generally, the pension plans don't have that same flexibility.
Got it. Is there, I'm getting some notes from folks in the room who are experts and want to chime in too, so I hope at some point we can maybe take a little bit of public testimony, because I think folks have relevant things to contribute. So my last question will be, what would the timelines be? So say, state law changed, or say the city decided to all of a sudden issue we're divesting from these types of industries. When is the soon, we're already in contracts and invested for certain timeframes. When is the soonest that something could, how many years or months?
Speaking for us, we have a lot of contracts. A lot of that would depend on that, but if the law changes, we will follow the law. We have no discretion, so we'll take the steps necessary, presumably even taking a loss to comply with the law. So and to be totally frank, I was here in 2014, and we had this conversation at that point, and I think that's probably the best way to go, is to go to the legislature and have 32 amended to reflect this type of divestment that you want.
Thank you.
Because we like I said, we'd be bound, so.
From the trust perspective, we're generally the same. There's a question of how long it takes, how long it could take. We've got a number of different funds, probably about 20, and we're adding more all the time. So there is a process involved in redeeming those shares. There's a process in finding replacement managers, and sometimes that can take a bit of time. Any PC can tell you how long it takes. It sometimes is not a quick process, because we want to make sure we get the right investment. So we would have to somehow pair up the strategy with something that most closely complements it, but kind of on the screen side. So it could conceivably take a while, and I think that's one of the reasons that for the pension funds that are talking about divesting, like New York City, sometimes they put it a number of years out, because it's something that nobody's really figured out yet how to do, and it's something that you would have to learn as you go to how you're able to effectively implement it without really damaging the portfolio.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to apologize to my colleagues who arrived way earlier. Council President Campbell was here, and I know Councilor Asabi George will be joining us. Before I recognize the next, I just wanted the OPEB trust was only started in 2009? So that's a new trust.
That's
Yep.
about 2009. Yeah.
What's the balance right now as far as what we have in there and what the liability is? Just provide some baseline. Yeah.
Well, liability is a bigger question, because we calculate
About
that.
$2 billion plus,
Right.
if my memory serves, but.
As far as balance in there now, we've got about $550 million in the OPEB trust, and we add money to that every single year, plus the investment returns. It's a little bit different from the pension system, because pension, we're putting money in, but we're also pulling money out. On the OPEB side of things, we're not pulling anything out yet.
Right.
I was just going to add, so the returns obviously are sort of, those are not part of the statutory responsibility that we have. Those are part of the schedules that we've assumed, particularly for pension. So the 7.5% allows us to reach full funding of the pension in 2025, assuming we can hit those returns. For OPEB, our return is about, estimated to be about 6.75%. Those are, I think, appropriately sort of aggressive, but certainly, as others have alluded to, there is quite a bit of ups and downs on those returns year over year. So 2 years ago, at the point at which we snapped the line on our last valuation, we had returns in excess of 17%, which helped us really feel confident about that 2025 timeline. Last year's returns were negative 5.6% against an assumption of 7.5%. And so those are something that we watch very carefully. It has a huge impact on the swing of our ability to fund the pension schedule. And as Tim alluded to, we're getting to the end of that, which is a wonderful thing. We're getting very close to fully funding our pension, but it means that those swings and returns are have a greater impact on our ability to hit those timelines and will directly impact what we have to invest in the annual budget as part of that. So I just wanted to clarify that they're not, while they're not statutorily required, there is a great deal of weight put on them.
Right. And Tim, with the retirement, we have obviously a liability there scheduled to be paid off in 2025. I believe out of operating, we're paying somewhere over $200 million, and then by 2025, it shoots up to 400 or so. And again, don't quote me, but
Right.
It balloons
that's
up, and I actually have the appropriation, if you want a
I have
copy
it
of
here,
it.
Tim.
You have it?
Yep. So FY19, $242 million. In FY24, which will be the high water mark because 25 is when we become full funded, $370 million. So the schedule assumes an 8.85% increase in the appropriation every year until full funding. And then once we achieve full funding, the plan is to sort of redirect those resources to address the massive OPEB liability.
right. And again, I just want to remind folks that we weren't doing this for a long time, so our generation, all our taxpayers, all of us here who care about the city, actually just started to address this in the last decade, especially OPEB.
Yep.
We weren't putting money away at all, and that's a severe disadvantage for our retirees and puts them in jeopardy, I would say. I'll recognize Councilor O'Malley at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you. I worked with all of you and know how committed you are to being, sound fiscal stewards and in the great work that you do. And I actually do have some questions about the mayor's announcement today, which I celebrate. I think it's a wonderful step. I think really having better divestment from the pension fund, and I understand some challenges there, but I think that's a great way to make it even better. So I will get to that in 1 minute. I just wanted to make sure I have my facts right. So we're at about the pension liabilities funded about 77% currently, and we're on track to get to 100% by 2025. Will that free up? Well, you mentioned, Emma, that it more of a volatile return, I guess, when it's fully funded.
So it will
Explain
free
that
up
a little bit.
resources, correct. So
Yeah.
if I could show you this thing that I'm looking at here, it's a lovely chart that shows in 2025, we still have some commitments that we need to make, right? We have the sort of pay-go as we go, and there will be some portion of the liability still in 2025, but based on the current pension schedule, we will go from $370 million in 2024 to $230 million in 2025 for pension alone. And then there's the question of OPEB.
And then what would it be in 2026?
I don't have that in front of me, but I can get it for you.
Presumably it'd go down, though.
It may uptick, well, yes, I think it would go down, yeah.
Okay. And does that allow for any freedom as it relates to Chapter 32 and sort of the restrictions at the state when you've got a fully funded pension?
No, because I would say, and Tim might have this percentage on him, most of the funds that are in our pension, that are invested as part of our pension system are actually employee contributions. So this is the
I
city's
see.
portion to get us to full funding.
I see.
But there is I think it's safe to say a majority of the funds are actually employee contributed funds.
Okay. And just so I have it right, you said none of our money is currently invested in or weapon manufacturers or intermingled?
None of our directly managed funds are currently in gun manufacturers.
Okay. A small
For the-
percentage is in for-profit prisons. You said $100,000.
Not our directly managed.
Not directly managed.
No.
That's the indirectly managed?
That's the commingled
The
funds.
commingled. So is commingled fund any money involved with gun manufacturers?
I think a very, very small amount. Drew, do you have that number?
Sure. So on the city side, we have, out of a portfolio of $730 million, we've got $742,000 indirectly exposed to gun manufacturers. That accounts for 0.10% of the portportfolio.
0.10%?
Yep.
And I assume the for-profit prison, the commingled funds is that was 100,000, then 8,000 library. That's probably very small.
0.0015.
All right, so even smaller. And what's the fossil fuel commingled fund percentage?
So commingled for fossil fuels would be 3.25%. So that is $23 million.
3.75%. So
I'm sorry,
that's-
3.25.
I'm sorry, you said that. My math. That's why I don't have your job, Drew. get percentages wrong. But still, that's a significant amount compared to the other two. And that's, I think, at the crux of what we want to get to today. I misspoke in my opening statement when I said $6 trillion has been divested from fossil fuels. The number as of December 8th, 2018 was actually $8 trillion. It had gone up an additional $2 trillion in a 2 or 3 month period. That shows significant leverage, and it's also the return on that investment has been remarkable. I know that we have money involved. I think you talked about some money that is, you talked about some of the wind and solar companies, the largest, I think, Tim, you had mentioned. So what's the percentage of our portfolio that's in renewables currently? Do we have that number?
I don't have it handy, but we can get that. For the
Is
time.
it more or less than 3.25%?
Oh, it's going to be less, right?
Less.
Less, okay. So I guess recognizing the constraints of Chapter 32 in the state legislature, I think at an absolute minimum, we should be looking today to making sure that we have significantly more money invested in renewable energy sources than traditional fossil fuels. And I think that's something we can do to both stay loyal to our fiduciary duty while at the same time investing in values of Boston. So I want to get to my colleagues. I'll stick around for some more questions the next round. But I'd like to get that percentage, since we have a pretty good percentage breakdown. What is our renewable percentage, particularly compared to fossil fuels, and how do we change that so that it's significantly more?
We are doing a search for renewables this year, so we're very excited to see what happens.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay. Well, thank you,
We'll let
Tim.
you know.
All right. You most certainly will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councilor Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can someone tell me what the acronym ESG means? What is it, ESG?
It's stands for, it's a catch-all that stands for environmental, social, and governance issues.
Okay, thank you. Tim, you had talked about where South Africa and gun manufacturing specifically named that we're not able to invest in. Where was that named again? We go back.
South Africa, Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
As well as tobacco companies. So
And named in 32G?
32, Chapter 32.
Okay, and that was done, we had to go up the
Many-
state with that
Many years ago, before predated my time at the board. But
through
it's-
ordinance?
I don't know if there-
Petition, rather.
I don't know if it was a local home rule petition or not. I can dig around and find out for you. I just don't know off the top of my head. It predated me. Do you know?
Yeah, okay. So, Emma, in 2025, are we going to have an extra $40 million to do something with?
I shouldn't have led with those numbers. So I think that our expectation, and certainly something that we will need to wrestle with in 2025, is the other post-employment benefit healthcare for retirees liability. So that liability is in $2 billion. We're making $40 million down payments on that liability. That does not fund what the actuaries tell us we should be funding every year on that liability. And so the expectation is that once we free up resources, as pension is fully funded, that we can dedicate a more substantial portion of those resources to
OPEB. Okay, so a lot of that 40 million will just go to to funding the retirement.
Yep. The next liability.
Yeah, it's a good move because I'm a retiree, so I don't want to get old. I don't want to not be able to work and not have anything coming in. Tim, you had a lot of paperwork over there that you said, you know, if you want a copy of this, you want a copy of this. If whatever it is you have that you think is pertinent, can you put together in a package and
Yep.
not right now. We don't need to do it now, but if you can get that over to me,
Be happy to do it.
whatever you have, and I think I'm good, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Cora. And thank you to Councilor Edwards, Wu, and O'Malley for your leadership on this, for your hard work, and for your dedication. I fully support not only sort of the hearing order and what was said in the hearing order, but some of the statements of my colleague, particularly Councilor Edwards, on, you know, our values say one thing, and so our money should follow our values. So I appreciate your leadership. And Councilor O'Malley and Councilor Wu, thank you for your previous leadership with the fossil fuels previous conversation. I've been doing a lot of listening, thank you. I'm learning a lot, quite a bit. And, you know, I don't like to waste time. So I just have, I guess just following up on Councilor O'Malley's point, which is what would keep us from doing what he was talking about, which was sort of going more into renewable and leaving fossil fuels behind? I think we're doing some of that, but what keeps us from going a little bit farther?
As to the retirement system, we are, as we said earlier, we are doing a search for renewables, so we're adding that to the portfolio. But as far as divestment, we're bound by Chapter 32, and PERAC has already weighed in twice, saying that you cannot do that.
So Tim, for you, it's do something with Chapter 32 and
At the State House.
And that was sort of some of my questions around the process of how those Chapter 32 changes were made. I want to give credit to Councilor Yancey, my predecessor from District 4, who was a leader with respect to this issue long before many, frankly, and specifically with respect to what was happening in South Africa at the time. I wasn't here then, I wasn't following, so I'm just curious, how did that happen? How did those changes with respect to that state law actually happen? Was it a home rule petition, or was it process? What was it?
It predated me, Counselor. I honestly can't say. I'm sorry.
And anyone else know?
I don't know, so I probably shouldn't say, but I suspect that because it was an outright change to state law that prohibited investment in those areas, that it actually was just worked its way through the legislative process rather than a home rule, but I'm not certain that that's true. So we can certainly look into that.
And, you know, first of all, thank you to the advocates in the room. I imagine it was a home rule petition. It was an ordinance. And so I guess quickly going back to the sponsors, how did we get that done then? Because I think obviously it's like, well, how do we use that process from before to get something done now? And that's a question. I don't know. Councilor Edwards, Councilor Wu, Councilor O'Malley, just curious.
Through the chair.
Through the chair, thank you. And I also I imagine at some point even public testimony, some of the advocates who were here then might have answers to that too.
Exactly.
Okay. We're going to have a few, yeah.
Okay, and I only ask because I have to run to a meeting outside, but I think, again, you know, I don't like wasting time. This is something we should absolutely be doing. And so I'm proud to work with colleagues who are also about getting things done. And if there's something to be learned specifically from the strategy of the past, you know, how do we do it now to be able to make a difference in state law? I mean, obviously other municipalities are looking at this too, but I would love to learn and understand a little bit more on the process piece and think about how we can continue to lead on the council side with respect to this and getting Chapter 32 change in other ways. So I just want to leave with that. I don't want to take too much time. I want to be able to hear from folks in the audience, and I can review the recording later with respect to the public testimony piece. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you again to my colleagues for your leadership on this. Thank you to the advocates. One thing I will add specifically on the prisons piece, because I care so deeply about criminal justice reform, and everyone knows why. There's a lot also happening around the country at the local level in New York with respect to these other companies that are preying on folks who are behind the walls, whether it's the telephone companies, the commissary companies, the exorbitant rates that these individuals have to pay or their families should be just unacceptable to anybody. And we usually don't pay attention because these people are hidden, right? They're not proximate to us in any way. But there are folks at the State House, including Rep. Tyler and some others, who are beginning to focus on what's happening in New York and other places, and there are advocates in the room who have been doing the work in New York to say what else could we be doing, not just divestment, but going after other companies that are preying on folks. And in the prison context, I just wanted to applaud Rep. Tyler, who's doing some work, and we're in conversations about how do we expand this conversation to other spaces to have an impact with respect to some of these companies that are preying on individuals who ultimately would come back to the city of Boston and be residents in our city. But they're being preyed on right now as we sit here. So just wanted to acknowledge that and thank the advocates again, and particularly those folks who've been doing the work in other states and then bringing what's been working there to us to see what we can do. So thank you. And thank you again, Councilor Siomo.
Councilor Sabi-George.
I want to thank the sponsors of this ordinance here, this hearing order, for their certainly their experience, their expertise, and their interest. I look forward to sort of following their lead to some degree and continuing to learn myself. I apologize for my lateness, so I'm not going to ask any questions because they may have been asked, and I look forward to just continuing to learn, but really hope that we are looking to leverage our investments, our strength really in changing outcomes on the other end, because we can do that and we should be doing that. Also interested in the relationship between the state law or code that we can impact or influence change to that as well. So I'm not going to take any other time, but I appreciate the opportunity and certainly the opportunity to learn.
Great, thank you, Counselor. I'm going to call up just 3 members at this time to testify publicly, 3 minutes. Bob Massey, Dick Clapp, Amanda Baraka. Hey, Tim, while they're making their way up, do you have a kind of a 10-year historical snapshot of aggregated returns?
Yes, I can get that for you.
And especially during the recession years,
Yeah.
just curious. Yeah, over there. The behind, go around? No, the other way, the other way. Thank you.
Chairman, I always use the extra directions.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and councilors. My name is Bob Massey. I'm honored to comment on the question of the City of Boston pursuing a socially aware investment policy. There's so much I want to say. I'm just going to whip through it. First, I want to say I've put 30 years into this. My doctorate at Harvard Business School was on this question of socially responsible investment and fiduciary duty. My book on the topic of the South African divestment answers your question, Counselor, and I can speak to that in a moment. And I have been the head of 4 organizations that deal with this. I used to be the president of Ceres, and I want to thank you for participating in Ceres. I was the founder of the Investor Network on Climate Risk. I was the founder of the Global Reporting Initiative, which you may be familiar with, and of the New Economy Coalition. So after writing about this for a long time, I just want to summarize that in my judgment, in certain cases, divestment can be smart, legal, effective, and in many cases, urgent. So again, I will just whip through this, but the problem with Wall Street, and I know many smart people apply themselves to analyzing our economy, but that often it is subject to groupthink and a failure to look forward. We have had 2 massive bubbles in the last 20 years, the tech bubble followed by the housing bubble. The 2 of those destroyed $11 trillion of value in the United States, and many people believe we are now in a carbon bubble. And by the way, I know we are talking about other issues, but I'm focusing on fossil fuel divestment. Legally, I would love to talk more with you gentlemen and others about fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty, I was a member of the $240 million Somerville Retirement Board. We made the judgment that our fiduciary duty required us to restrict our investments because the fossil fuel industry is a broken and dying business model. Peabody Coal was $1,000 a share. It went to $2 a share and then went bankrupt. And all the way down, people said it was going to come back. So I would like to simply say that trustees exercising their fiduciary judgment can decide to exclude companies that they believe are in an industry that will fail. I can't go into the question of effectiveness, but I do address that in my 800-page book. So if you'd like me to enter into that as my testimony, I'd be happy to do that. And I just want to conclude by saying that we in the baby boomer generation, whatever our achievements, will be remembered hundreds of years from now for 2 things. One is failing to address climate change. Wall Street is only now waking up. And the other is the failure to address wealth inequality. We could address both of those in the Green New Deal and in the actions that you're considering taking, and I strongly recommend that you institute such policies. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, were you going to answer the question on the apartheid?
Yes. So as quickly as I can, it was a bubbling question in 1982. the state legislature passed a divestment bill. It was vetoed by Governor King. Governor Dukakis took office in early 1983, and he signed the bill. It was passed again, and he signed the new version, making Massachusetts the first state in the nation to have an investment policy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Someone texted too from the audience. I guess it was state legislation led by Mel King and some others. So, yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Okay.
On the Chapter 32 question, Bob, is there any insight on the current state law?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I just closed my computer. But as I believe PERAC has fundamentally misinterpreted Chapter 32 on the basis of the last 11 words in the statute, in the section that they cite. It says, you may not do this, you may not do that, you must diversify, you must do that, unless you believe it is risky to do so. So our judgment was exactly that it was risky to do so. And so the message that PERAC sends out and the letter that it wrote, all the way back in June 2015, cites a piece of legislation that in fact authorizes us to do. So I would just say, look at the last 11 words, and gentlemen, I'd like you to look at the last 11 words and see that PERAC, if you feel in your investment policy that something is risky, you are authorized to make the appropriate decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for inviting me up here. My name is Dick Clapp. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you again. I'm a retired professor of public health. I had some written remarks that I would like to submit, and rather than waste your time and mine by going through those, I would just simply say we have to divest. We have no choice. It's a public health emergency that we divest from fossil fuels, and the reason is, from my perspective, it's the #1 public health challenge facing the next generations. So we have to move off of fossil fuels into alternative methods of generating electricity, especially, and that divestment pushes us in that direction. I'd also like to say a few things in the couple of minutes that I have about divestment from South Africa. I was here at the time. I was a state employee at the time, and I actually was treasurer of something called Mass Divest, which was us state employee pension holders and or payers into the pension system who wanted our money taken out of companies that were operating in South Africa. Representative Mel King led that in the State House, and State Senator Jack Bachman led it in the Senate. Passed twice, was vetoed twice, overridden by the state legislature, and became signed into law, as Bob just said, by Governor Dukakis. And I should also say, although I am a retired professor, I do not have an 800-page book to give to you on this. I do have my own experience, though. And I was involved in meeting with the state treasurer to look at the companies that were invested or still operating in South Africa and how much the state pension fund held in stocks in those companies. And the state treasurer's assistant, a guy named Phil Kett, said we would lose money if we divested those. Actually, if you looked at the cost of the stocks and then the current value, and this was in the early 1980s, they would have made money, or they did make money by divesting from those stocks. So I urge the BRS staff to take that into account and to think of it as a potential opportunity to benefit the pension holders in this city. And then as regards how did it work, I know Councilor Campbell asked a couple of times, and you mentioned that Charles Yancey led that effort in the city council. Ask him how it worked. And similarly, Mel King. If it was a local petition or home rule petition from the city delegation, Mel would know that. They're still around. They're sharp as they ever were, and you can get information from them. So I guess with that, I would just say, for the benefit of present and future generations, I urge you to take action to divest from fossil fuels.
Thank you. So is Amanda?
Thank you all for hearing my testimony. I implore you all to stay for the organized panels, but I would like to share a bit of a personal story with you. So my name is Amanda Baraka, and I was born in Boston to two immigrant families. My mom's parents were fishermen from Sicily who moved here to the North End, and my dad moved here from Bethlehem in Palestine and worked as a surgeon caring for children in Boston. I'm a member of the network called the Palestinian Community in Boston. I'm here today to share why it is imperative that any socially responsible investment criteria or policy passed in Boston must include criteria around human rights. Boston's community today is made of indigenous folks, descendants of early settlers, refugees, and immigrants and their children like me, who have relatives across the globe. I believe every single person deserves freedom, dignity, and respect. In short, I believe in human rights, and I know Boston does too, as it declared itself a human rights city in April of 2011. The problem is that the entirety of Boston's money has no investment criteria to ensure that our dollars are aligned with this most basic and universal value. What this means is that billions of dollars of Boston's money is actively perpetuating harm to our relatives both here and abroad, and what's worse is that we're making money off of that violence. Let me share one example, the one that I know most about because it affects my family directly. In the first 2 years of the 2000s, 52 Palestinian women were forced to give birth at militarized checkpoints in the occupied West Bank because Israeli soldiers denied them permission to cross through freely to get to hospitals. 19 of these women died, and 29 of these newborns died. An American company, Motorola Solutions, provides communication services to the Israeli military that denies this freedom of movement and actively denies access to emergency healthcare to Palestinians. Companies from around the world enable these egregious harms to be committed against Palestinians and against many more communities to whom we are linked as Boston residents. The good news is we have the agency to divest ourselves from HR violations by adopting an HR criterion. There are existing investment industry human rights screens that we could easily adopt. That's no more work for us. The even better news is that we know this strategy is proven to be effective in changing conditions on the ground for people experiencing oppression. For example, following divestment campaigns, the British security company G4S pulled out of youth prisons in Israel and all over the world, and the French company Veolia has stopped operating racially segregated buses in Israel. We as a community in Boston have the power and the responsibility to impact global human rights by aligning our investments with our values. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Could you, Tim, what were those judgments that you spoke about earlier about Somerville and Cambridge? What was that related to?
Well, I think Mr. Massey may be able to speak better, but I have the PARAC letters, right? My read is they were trying to divest from fossil fuels, and put my glasses back on. And PARAC relied on Section 23, Sub 3, which is the fiduciary duty, as Mr. Massey said. I think the key language in this letter is, in the absence of a statutory restriction pertaining to investment in fossil fuels, this is for Cambridge, the CRB must have assets, one, for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits to members and their beneficiaries, and two, as a prudent expert would in investing funds as set forth in 84 CMR 1.01. Constraining investment options has a significant impact on potential investment returns. Any direct loss or loss due to missed opportunity in these investments raise the possibility of personal liability for CRB members.
All right, great. I'm going to, another round. Councilor Edwards.
Thank you. It was, I was just trying to read it along with you. It was Section 23, so it's Chapter 32, Section 23.
Sub 3.
Sub 3, okay.
And again, I'll make all that available.
That's great. I think it's really important, again, for us to see the framework with which we're going to work with, and hopefully the framework also that we will reform. But I want to just make sure that we're going back and just fill in some gaps that we had talked about. And again, thank you for the numbers and being totally transparent. When you say, this is to Commissioner, no, Chief. I got your title messed up. Which one? What do you want to be today? Commissioner's work? Okay, Emma. So when you say that we're working on getting our money, at least the library fund, out of the private prison, and I think maybe even the $100,000. When you say we're working on that, so what does that mean? Walk me through the steps of being able to pull out.
So we don't manage the library, we invest the library's funds, but we don't actually manage their investment decisions. That will require action by the trustees of the library. And so those are sort of sitting with Drew's resources, but that's really sort of on its own path in terms of the library. They're aware that it exists, and so that will take a vote of the trustees. I think the thrust of your question, Councillor, which is a very good one, is how do we make that change? And I think part of the issue for the City of Boston, particularly in some of these smaller investments, is having an alternative vehicle that we can use that we are certain doesn't have exposure to some of these things. And I think
Right.
that's where we have some, the path to us is not completely clear on that, where that opportunity exists, but it's something that we're actively working on. Do you have anything to add to that, Drew?
No.
So who is going to tell us how they're walking us out and give us a deadline for, I know it's a small amount of money, it's
Yep.
money I still don't want there. So
Yep.
how do we, who's going to give us the deadline? Who would we hold accountable for not meeting that deadline?
Sure.
How do we pull the money? And I'm
Yep.
understanding it's convoluted and complicated.
Yep.
If you can't walk us through it right now, I
Yep.
respect that.
So-
But, go ahead.
I will absolutely take the accountability to come back to the council and update you on what it is that we find out and what steps are available to us. I think there's a question for the trustees just in terms of how they move forward, but I think on the other issues, I will certainly report back and let you know what it is that we found and what a timeline might be and what potential opportunities or pitfalls there might be around that.
No, and I appreciate that. I think I know there's a difference between trying to move $23 million and $8,000.
Yep.
But there are lessons to be learned.
Sure.
And in as much as it's $8,000, that means that we can learn it relatively quickly, I think, and get this
Yep.
money out. 100 also, I'm not forgetting about the other 100,000,
Yep,
but
so that one, I just want to be clear, is retirement system
that's over with the
funds.
pension.
Exactly. And so I think that it's an individual investment, so I'm not sure what your process is for that. But the BRS is controlled by a board, and so the board on sort of higher level decisions is what governs that.
And to that point, that investment, I don't know if this is working, that investment is held in an indirect or in a fund. So that's not a security that we could direct a manager to sell.
It's one of
even if-
many in the
Even if we
fund.
wanted to. So
Okay.
we are a holder of a fund, and then the manager makes decisions about
Right.
what he or she puts in the fund.
And so that speaks to then, this, right when we go to get and acquire certain funds and work with investors, that conversation right there, because it seems like we relinquish so much control because there's so many mutual funds upon mutual funds upon mutual funds that it's hard to know when, the branch and the roots keep going beyond what we know. So it's important, I should say, the branch goes far, that we get to the root of how we began these relationships with some of the funders.
Yep.
And at that point, what are the conversations? And I think my colleague, Councilor Wu, was really trying to get to that too. At that point, when we're talking to them, when we're trying to grab them, are we still getting new investors and funds, or are we holding on to what we have? And when we do go to acquire new ones, are we saying anything in terms of standards, what we want? Or one other thing that we can do beyond 32 is say, report what you have to us, and then we'll make an informed decision if it's worth it to us to go to you. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay.
So, so there are a lot of questions in there. The first is we do continue to hold some existing funds, but we're always looking at new investments. As I mentioned earlier, ESG is part of the due diligence process that we do, but it's not the sole part. There are some managers that deliver a great investment return that frankly aren't as focused on ESG as other ones are. So I do think that is part of it, and that is something that we've committed to communicate to the board what the ESG rating is for different managers to help inform that discussion when they come in.
Okay. So for new ones, you're using the ESG standards, or telling the board at least what the ESG standards are, then they make that decision.
Yes.
Right. Is there any way, I would ask that you also set a standard or questions or something to give to the board, to give to those managers about where their funds are. I would like for them just outright say it. We are invested in private prisons. We are invested in fossil fuels. We are invested to certain amounts, because I don't think it should be your jobs to chase down every single branch and, rabbit hole and whatnot to find out where this money is. I think if they want our investment, then they should come forth and be totally transparent from day one.
Yeah, and
Could you do that?
I think you can do it with some of the investments. There are some which are not pre-prescribed. So for example, you make an investment in somebody that invests in companies or real estate or whatever. They don't know what their portfolio looks like until they go out and buy those. So but you can get a historical look and say, you know,
Right.
how have you done this in the past?
Right.
I think that's where the ESG aspect gets
Okay.
into it.
Just a couple other follow-up questions to the city side on some of the flexibility that we have. I'm just going to ask outright, can we invest in cooperative investment or community-owned cooperatives?
Oh, so, as I said, we've been having a lot of conversations over on the A&F side about how we can leverage the city's assets, and one of the questions we've been asking is okay, well, what does that look like, and how could we conceivably do it? We have asked the question of attorneys, of our attorneys, as far as, well, if we wanted to take a portion of our funds and invest in some type of disadvantaged business lending or some kind of program like that, regardless of what it is, what would the process for that be? It's a conversation that we continue to have. There's not an easy answer. I can't easily say, yes, we can definitely do it, because we have to make sure that we stay within the bounds of what's allowed under Commonwealth statute and under the law generally, and our fiduciary obligation. But the reason is most of these trusts, you're investing in actual securities, right? So you're investing in investments. And a lot of these cooperatives and things like that, they're not necessarily structured as securities. So they're agreements and things like that. So it would take a little bit of work. Again, it's a question we're asking, but on the cash side,
Right.
no.
You can't do it, the
Not
cash
on the
side.
cash side.
But so just to let you know about some of their third part, I know we discussed, while it may be difficult for the city specifically to invest in them, there are third-party cooperatively owned investors that might also be worth infusing some funds into. I think Berkeley is looking at doing that. And just also would like to bring up the Ujima Fund, the Co-op Fund of New England, LEAF. These are all community kind of owned, dedicated funders of cooperatives. So I just want to make sure that the city is aware of that. With the $150 million that we are now investing in, as an activist, I guess. The city is a activist investor.
Those are two slightly different things.
I think so, yeah.
That just refers to the series. That refers to the series
Okay.
announcement. But yes, all under the same umbrella.
Okay.
So that $150 million is out of the cash portfolio, and I think, as Drew alluded to,
And our
liquidity-
operating funds, right?
Operating funds,
Operating
exactly.
funds.
The liquidity is sort of core to what we need to preserve as part of that. And so I think something that needed some longer-term payoff rather than what's the general horizon on those investments?
Less than 397 days. It's really, what we need for those is daily liquidity. I need to be able to make sure we can
So we
get
have to be
it
able to call and
any
pull the
day.
money out if we need
Right.
it to
Yeah.
make a payroll or fill a,
Right.
whatever it
So
may
there's
be.
a certain level of flexibility, but in that, you have agreed, or you will not be invested, obviously, in private prisons. You'll be prison-free, you'll be fossil fuel-free, you'll be, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so, and those standards are written down somewhere?
So,
Or you're just generally doing the ESG?
yeah,
So the 150 is targeted to ESG.
Okay.
The 150 million is targeted to ESG businesses, with an additional $100 million targeted to community banks.
Okay.
There is a balance of other funds that we keep as just literal cash in our bank account, so that we can do things that when a payroll runs, when we pay vendors, whatever it may be. And so those are not invested. Those are
Right.
not sort of buying stocks and bonds for private prisons or whatever else it may be that folks are concerned about.
Last one, and I just want to make sure are aware of the tool that was already established again by my predecessor, Councilor Arroyo. This was literally the ordinance put in to create a municipal, I think it was the Municipal Community Banking Commission. We created this commission, is my point, and I think they have certain guidelines already in community banking and investment and looking at ways in which the city should be moving the money. We have this as an ordinance. Have you looked at that ordinance?
I'm not familiar with it, but
Have you looked at the
certainly happy to.
commission's charge?
I'm not familiar with it, but I'll check into it.
So I would encourage us to get familiar with it and also look at ways in which we can, again, I'm not seeing that as a negative. I'm saying this is something already established as a way, since we're talking about community banking, and this is literally the Municipal Depositories Contracts for Banking Services Ordinance that established it. I think it would be a wonderful partnership to see how we can update this ordinance, update the commission's charge, and really make that part of this conversation as well. I hope you would commit to that.
We'll look into it. Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Wu? We're good. Counselor Flynn? That's it. Should I
for coordinating this meeting, especially Council Wu, Edwards, and O'Malley, and for your commitment to making sure that the City of Boston does invest in the proper resources and making sure that we also have sound fiscal policy and fiscal management as well. And to the panelists that are here today, I also want to thank you for making sure that you're watching carefully and keeping Boston's fiscal health on track. That's very important for our city workers that clean the streets and teach our children. They fix our sewers, coach our basketball, provide care for the disabled. So I want to say thank you to you, Tim, and all that the City of Boston Retirement Board does for so many retirees, and they really depend on the City of Boston Retirement Board to provide strong fiscal oversight, and I'm glad that we have strong leadership with you and your team as well. Drew, I know you talked about community banking. Can you give us a bit of a little more input on, as it relates to investing in community banking, do we know if some of that money is going back into building affordable housing for low-income families or for people in need?
So because we're making a deposit as opposed to kind of mandating exactly how they have to use it, it would be difficult for me to say with any certainty exactly what I would assume the enhanced level of lending is actually going to support. So I really wouldn't be able to say. In theory, to the extent that you're increasing assets in the bank, it should spur lending from the bank. But beyond that, I'm just not able to be certain.
Thank you. I think that's an important thing that you're doing, is investing in community banking, making sure that money goes back into the neighborhood for, hopefully, for affordable housing, giving people the opportunity for the American dream to own a home. I think it's critical, especially in some of the neighborhoods that really need it. So thank you for your work on that issue.
Thank you. All set?
Just for the record, it's the ordinances, I think it's the 6-8, called Municipal Depositories and Contracts for Banking Services. And the commission, I just wanted to make sure I got the name right, give credit where credit's due to Councilor Arroyo. It is the Municipal Banking and Community Reinvestment Commission that was established already in ordinance. And so maybe we can talk a little bit how we can react and get them involved again.
Okay, I can look that up.
And again, I think just for the audience education's sake, this is, so we did have conversation with them before, with our panelists before. This is a collaborative effort, one in which I thank them for coming forth with all the numbers. And this is the beginning of the conversation. We can move from here to working sessions where we're talking about either this commission, or we're talking about what divestment looks like. We're talking about also what investment looks like. All of that likely will not happen today because it's such a big conversation. And there's so many tools in the toolbox that we can hopefully create together to make sure we're investing in a socially responsible way. But I did want to thank the panelists for that, and I thank you in advance for your commitment to all of those conversations as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Tim, just before I let you guys go, you said you had the historical return, like for the past 10 years, the aggregate.
Yes.
Can you, like going back to say 09, do you have that?
Oh, wait, I've got it all. I just don't have it committed to memory.
All right.
But I can tell you, going back 35 years, it's 9.06%. But I definitely have that data in my office.
Yeah, just curious, especially, the
was a big
recession years and then.
Big drop, right? Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm going to call some folks from the public to testify at this time before we bring up the next panel, which is the divestment panel. Bianca, I guess you know who you are. So members of the public, William Room, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Ming. Amber James, Ashley James, and Pearl Batragar. Hi.
You got the name right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Cuomo, members of the council. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic, and thank you to Councilors Edwards, Wu, and O'Malley for sponsoring this hearing. My name is William Room. I'm a resident of Boston, a social worker in the city, and I'm a member of Massachusetts Against Hewlett-Packard, which is now a coalition of groups calling upon our municipalities to move our public money away from companies who are complicit in the Israeli government's violation of Palestinian human and civil rights, and in the U.S. government's violation of the human and civil rights of immigrants and of people who are serving or have served time in state, federal, or private prisons. I'm here today because I want to support the efforts of the City Council to reinvest all of its approximately $6.5 billion worth of cash investments or pension funds, or at least those that can be moved reasonably, to reinvest those funds in companies who do not profit off of the violation of human and civil rights, and toward entities, and I'm sure you'll hear from them today, who promote racial justice, housing justice, a livable environment, and environmental sustainability. So 2 examples. The City of Boston, I believe, has a deep ethical obligation to move all direct and indirect investments out of the company G4S. This is a security company that profits from the detention and deportation of unaccompanied immigrant children domestically. I also believe that the City of Boston has an ethical obligation to end all direct and indirect investments in the weapons manufacturing company, Northrop Grumman. And just a note, the CFO from the mayor's office, I believe she said the city is not implicated in gun manufacturers, but I do believe the city has investments in military weapons manufacturers, including Northrop Grumman and others. Northrop Grumman sells weapons and military vehicles to the Israeli army, facilitating the Israeli government's ongoing displacement of Palestinians from their homes and villages in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, through the expansion and creation of settlements open only to Jewish Israelis on Palestinian land, a practice that is categorically and unequivocally illegal under international law, according to the Fourth Geneva Convention. So just to close up, I believe we as a city have an ability and also a responsibility to do our part in building towards the more just and livable future that we all need and deserve. And that starts with where we put our assets. So I applaud you for taking this effort. And in following the brilliant example of other cities across the U.S. who, one after another with success, are moving money away from prisons, from deportations, from fossil fuels, and from the violation of Palestinian civil and human rights. So let's do the same. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Please, folks. I called some of Amber Ashley James. No? Oh, okay.
Thank you. My name is Amber Ashley James. I'm a student at Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School and an organizer for the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign. I want to talk to you today a little bit about my client, Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown grew up in Roxbury, just a few miles away from here. He's a middle-aged black man with a big personality and a sharp wit. He's a father of 2. Last Wednesday, I visited Mr. Brown at Suffolk County House of Corrections, where he's currently being held. It was his daughter's 9th birthday. He obviously wasn't able to celebrate with her in person. Jail is no place for a little girl, especially on her birthday. So he called her like any loving father would. But incarcerated people can be charged as much as $25 for 15-minute phone calls. For my client, Mr. Brown, that's a month's labor. Incarcerated people in Massachusetts can earn $1 per day for their labor in the facilities where they're being held. I'm here today on behalf of Mr. Brown, the 2.3 million others held in prisons and jails in this country, and the 4 million more under state surveillance on probation or parole. Mr. Brown's story captures just a few of the many, many problems that he and millions more like him who are incarcerated face. And the root of all of these problems is money. Private companies operating in the criminal justice system make money off of poor incarcerated people and their families. These companies are financed by institutional investors like Harvard and its endowment, and cities like Boston and its pension and retirement funds. These investors earn interest on investments in companies that prey on poor incarcerated people and their families during some of their most vulnerable moments. This is bigger than just private prisons. The entire prison industrial complex is a $400 billion per year industry. Just one example is the $2 billion bail bond industry that turns a profit by charging poor people sky-high interest rates and hidden fees on bail loans. Harvard and institutional investors like the City of Boston finance this extortion through direct and indirect investments in funds that hold millions of shares in the leading bail bonds companies. Another example is the prison telecom industry, the multi-billion-dollar industry that extracts money from clients like mine, Mr. Brown, and millions of others who just want to have some human connection with their loved ones. These companies are owned by private equity funds which are financed by pension funds like the City of Boston's. Investors give these predatory companies the money that they need to operate. The solution is to take that money away. And that's all we're asking the City of Boston to do. Two things: divest and reinvest. We're asking the City of Boston to live up to its values, divest from all of its investments, both direct and indirect, and all of its exposure to the prison industrial complex, and reinvest that money in industries and companies that help communities like our own thrive. There is no dichotomy between socially and fiscally responsible investing. That is a fallacy. These are not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing goals. We can run this grand city, we can take care of Boston's employees, we can take care of Boston's retirees without profiting from the extortion of poor incarcerated people. For my client, Mr. Brown, and millions more like him, we have an obligation to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I did call Ming, possibly? And Pearl was the last one. Okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Pearl Butnagar, and I'm the national organizer with Freedom Cities. We're a coalition of organizations across the country, and we're committed to redefining safety and ending criminalization. The way that we do this is by divesting from police and prisons and reinvesting in community wellness. This looks like housing, this looks like healthcare, jobs, and mental health. And since 2012, our members and partners have divested $4.3 billion from the prison industry. Our members understand that all of our struggles are interconnected, that we cannot be a true freedom city if we are naming our concern for only one demographic. We know that immigrant rights are connected to racial justice, worker rights, and LGBTQ rights, because my liberation is tied to yours. That is why witnessing organizers and activists from across the movement ecosystem in Boston is so heartening for me today. And this is a model for the whole country, a model that shows that reinvestment in our communities begins with reinvestment in each other. We're a network that understands that criminalization can end if we pay attention to what we want to grow, rather than profiting off of caging Black and brown people in the US and abroad, as folks have named. I'm here to show solidarity with community members in Boston and to bring the well wishes of folks from across the country who know that intersectional divestment and reinvestment is a cutting-edge strategy and the way forward. Today, I want to call into the room the powerful and precedent-setting work of Freedom Cities member, Freedom to Thrive, which initially started a coalition to divest from the prison industry in Portland in 2013. But similar to what we're seeing here today happening in Boston, the Portland organizers knew that the only way to move forward was together. They convened 25 diverse groups following the lead of the most directly impacted, linking prison divestment with no DAPL to the Israeli occupation and fossil fuel divestment. They did this work in the months leading up to and during the election of '45. To be a sanctuary city, to be a freedom city, the local government needed to walk their talk and proactively take care of all marginalized people. And Portland community members held them to account, just as Boston community members are doing today. In April 2017, I just want to remind folks that Portland City Council voted to permanently end all investments, not only in prisons,
or the militarization of countries abroad or fossil fuels, but in all corporate securities, setting a precedent for the rest of the country by doing so for the first time. Portland pushed a socially responsible investments policy with a human rights criteria. Boston can also become a freedom city, taking action to invest in all members of the community by doing so too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So now I'm going to call up the divestment panel at this time. Thank you. So I'll call off the names: Bianca Tylek, João Pereira, Anna Milosevic, Shannon Al-Wakil, Balaji Alagbegji, and Abun Osanaubi.
So you can wrap around. Yeah.
Grab it.
You can both come this way. I didn't realize the panel was so big.
Thank you. And I just want to apologize. I have to leave, and I'm going to hand the gavel over to my able friend from East Boston. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So we are going to go ahead. I don't know if you have a planned presentation and you have an order in which you're going to speak, or how
More or
would you like
less.
to go?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Bianca Tylek. I'm the director of the Corrections Accountability Project. We're a nonprofit criminal justice advocacy organization committed to dismantling the prison industrial complex and ending the exploitation of those it touches. I want to thank Chair Siomo and fellow members of the Committee on Ways and Means Committee, though they're not here, for the opportunity to speak to you today about how Boston invests its funds, and to strongly urge disclosure, divestment from social harm, and socially responsible reinvestment. I would also like to thank Councillor Edwards, Councillor Wu, and Councillor O'Malley for their leadership on this issue and for lifting up this critical conversation. Last September, we partnered with dozens of local and national advocacy organizations, faith-based communities, university groups, and investment firms to launch a coordinated prison divestment campaign in Greater Boston, calling for the divestment from 7 morally corrupt companies that operate within the prison industrial complex. In my written testimony, I have included additional information on each of these companies. It looks like this, that begins to touch on the exploitative practices of these companies. 5 months after the launch of the Boston Prison Divestment Campaign, we are so proud to be here, not just with groups that joined our original call for prison divestment, but with an intersectional community dedicated to aligning Boston's investments with its values. Today, you will hear from organizational leaders across a broad range of social justice issues on 3 panels: divestment, reinvestment, and socially responsible investing. You will hear from organizations like Better Future Project, which advocates for climate justice and fossil fuel divestment. You will hear from Boston Ujima Project, which is creating the blueprint for community reinvestment, and a whole host of representatives from firms who demonstrate the viability of socially responsible investing every day. Now, I would like to dive into the case for divestment, and specifically prison divestment. I'm going to skip over a few things that have already been mentioned in the, to protect everyone's time. So, folks have been talking about sort of the South Africa divestment, and I want to say that Boston divested because there was no room for reforming a financial relationship that depended on injustice. And today's call for divestment leans on that same reason. In the criminal justice context, the divestment movement has gained critical momentum, pushing institutions to divest over $4.3 billion from the private prison industry in less than a decade. In 2015, divestment began on campuses like Columbia University, University of California, and Hampshire College. Since then, some of the largest teacher pensions have also divested from the prison industry, citing a range of financial risks and ethical concerns, including the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund and the California State Teachers Retirement System. The American Federation of Teachers, the second largest union in the country, also released 2 reports in just the last 6 months, urging investors to divest from the prison industrial complex beyond just private prisons, but also correctional services companies. In 2017, cities and states also began to divest, many of them Boston's neighbors right here in the Northeast. New York City became the first city to announce the divestment of its pension plan from private prisons, and a few months later, Philadelphia followed suit with its when its retirement board voted to divest the city's pension. And just last year, New York State joined the growing list. And as you heard from Pearl, on the West Coast, Portland, Oregon took divestment to the next level when its city council voted to divest from all corporations, a landmark decision that highlighted the power of the type of intersectional organizing that we see here today. This brief history of prison divestment in the U.S. over the last decade begs the question, where is Boston? We know that Boston's values do not align with the active role that its investments play in perpetuating mass incarceration. Massachusetts has historically made a number of intentional decisions that demonstrate efforts to steer clear of the prison industrial complex. For example, there is no bail bonds industry in the state, nor has there ever been a single private prison. Yet Boston continues to fund these companies and others engaged in mass incarceration here and elsewhere and profit from it. Perhaps one of the most critical recent representations of Boston's values came when Boston declared itself a sanctuary city. In doing so, Boston made a bold and public statement that the city is an unconditional safe haven for immigrants, and rightly so, with more than 27% of its residents born abroad. Yet we know that companies that profit from our criminal legal system employ those same exploitative tactics in profiting off of communities devastated by immigration detention. How can we maintain that Boston is welcoming to immigrants while funding the companies that put their families in cages? It is as if to say it is fine for those companies to kidnap, lock up, and commodify our neighbors across the country, but not Bostonians. And still, the prison industrial complex does not simply implicate criminal and immigration injustices. It also connects to issues of racial and economic inequality, transphobia, militarization, occupation, and climate injustice, many of the causes that our partners here will speak to next. Those who profit from the prison industrial complex depend on these and other societal failures to create vulnerable communities for their exploitation. It is precisely for that reason that we are walking together in lockstep with our allies here as a collaborative and coordinated progressive movement, because we can only win together. In divesting and setting proper investment guidelines, Boston makes a statement not just about one issue, but more broadly about how it should be using and investing city funds. It is up to the City Council to ensure that Boston be proactive about where it puts its money, not reactive to moral and ethical national crises like mass incarceration and family detention. So we're excited to work with the City Council to light up Boston again as a national beacon of progressive values. With that, I want to make one quick correction from the folks who are no longer sitting here. Boston is directly invested in a separately managed account, specifically through two specific investments, having looked at the Boston retirement system's actual investments. There are two investments that have exposure, which is the investments in the iShares Russell 2000 and the iShares Russell 2000 Value ETF. Both of those direct investments have exposure to private prisons, both core civic and geo.
Can you just repeat those?
Sure. iShares Russell 2000 ETF and the iShares Russell's 2000 Value ETF. Both of those, which are essentially common stock, also have underlying exposure to both core civic and geo group. And it is concerning, I think, at least for me, that it was sort of mentioned several times that they don't even know what they're invested in because of the commingled asset.
So just to make sure I'm clear that I know what you're saying, unlike it being a mutual, are you saying this is a mutual fund and one aspect
So
of it,
an
or is it a direct?
ETF
Let me just make sure I'm clear on my
Yeah, okay,
question.
go ahead.
That we own a specific amount of stock in this company directly. Is that what you're saying?
So it's through an ETF. An ETF is essentially it's an exchange fund. So it's like a mutual fund that actually has its own ticker. And therefore has underlying. So if you were to go to iShares Russell, you could go buy, let's say like Councilor Edwards, you could go buy an ETF stock, right? Unlike some of the fund of funds and hedge funds that are a little bit more complicated. So it's a direct investment that they could sell tomorrow in like that stock, and it's within the, because we've seen the document, we know that there's 3 tabs. There's a separately managed, a commingled, and their private equity investments. It's in their separately managed accounts.
Thank you.
My turn. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is John Pereira, and I am a student at Roxbury Community College here representing college-bound Dorchester. I grew up in Dorchester and have lived in Boston, the Boston area nearly my whole life. I am here today to speak about the ways the prison industrial complex has affected me and how the companies that Boston has invested in have stripped resources from me and my family. I have been incarcerated in and out of county, state, and federal facilities for a total of 13 years. I have been caged in numerous facilities across multiple states, so unfortunately, I know from a very personal place. I know prison from a very personal place. If you want to serve your sentence with your dignity intact, it can get quite expensive. When you walk into jail or prison, you start with a small bag with just soap, toothpaste, and a toothbrush. You change into a uniform, but if you're in a county jail, you don't even get any new underwear or a new pair of socks. Anything else you need, you must buy while making pennies at an hour at best. If you don't have any family or friends to support you, you may have to depend on that bag of hazardous chemicals for survival or live in the underwear you were arrested in the whole time there. See, the difference between serving your sentence with humanity and living like a caged animal all depends on your financial situation. Correctional service companies like Securus, Global Tel-Link, Keefe, and Trinity Services contract with prisons to provide things like phone calls and commissary. They specialize in exploiting people within the criminal system by charging exorbitantly high rates and fees for basic necessities, things we take for granted like soap, toothpaste, deodorant, and a phone call to a loved one. And it's not just us on the inside that get exploited, but our family as well. See, one of the first things you want to do when you get inside is call a lifeline. But to call someone, you will need money on your account. There were moments when I only had enough money to call to ask someone for money. This creates strains in your relationships. Prison is not for anyone with anxiety issues. I remember going for months without any money for the phone calls or commissaries. It makes you bitter towards the world. You feel isolated and outcasted from the rest of humanity as if you really are an animal. You become accustomed to being taken advantage of, exploited, and commodified, and often see sheer violence as an only option. You are no longer living, just survival. Companies that profit off of prisoners inflame these emotions with their unapologetically exploitative business dealings and practices. I have seen plenty of violent outbreaks due to commissary or phone-related incidents. Men forced to resort to physical combat and petty squabbles over ramen noodles or coffee. This whole atmosphere is fueled by the rigid dichotomy between justice and capitalism. It's no surprise that the prisons devolve into chaos. You can't blame the desperate and voiceless, we who are labeled criminals. The blame lays right here with those who make the decision to let those companies in, partner in their exploitation of us, and profit from their investment in these companies. I am asking you to recognize me as human, not as my crimes, and divest Boston from the prison profiteers that exploited my vulnerability and continue to do so to those I left behind and the families supporting them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Anna Milosavljevic, and I'm a member of Massachusetts Peace Action, the local chapter of the nation's largest grassroots peace and disarmament organization. In this testimony, I hope to highlight the city's admirable commitments to upholding human rights and shed light on its current investments in companies profiting from the violation of such rights. In my written testimony, I further expand on the city's obligation to divest from companies engaged in the development of nuclear weapons and those enabling the human rights violations perpetrated by Saudi Arabia and Israel. In 2014 and 2015, the Boston City Council recognized the devastation that nuclear weapons cause and called on President Obama and Congress to, quote, cancel costly new nuclear and other weapon systems which do not make us safer, and to allocate the savings for programs and the people of Boston and other cities urgently need. In 2012, residents across Massachusetts affirmed such priorities by overwhelmingly voting in favor of the Budget for All, which called for the redirection of military spending to domestic needs and job creation. 157,000 of over 200,000 Bostonians who voted indicated they were in favor of such demands. Investments in nuclear weapons create a perverse financial incentive for the world to edge closer and closer to the brink of nuclear warfare. To realign itself with the council's past statements and the priorities of the residents they represent, Boston must divest from any company in the business of destruction. Similarly, the city's investments in weapon manufacturers doing business with the Saudi Arabian government fuel a variety of human rights violations, conflicting with the city's 2011 declaration as a human rights city, as was previously mentioned today. Since 2015, Saudi Arabia has led a coalition comprised of the United Arab Emirates and other governments in waging a brutal war on Yemen. The coalition's continued bombing of innocent civilians and critical infrastructure has created conditions that have left 18 million Yemenis at risk of famine. Military contractors selling these weapons to Saudi Arabia are complicit in this war, profiting off of the atrocities being committed. As a human rights city, it's imperative that Boston revoke its investments in military contractors enabling this massacre. It's also worth noting that momentum for such divestment is already underway. In January 2019, the Massachusetts House of Representatives introduced a bill related to the state's pensions divestment from companies selling to Saudi Arabia. And finally, I must also speak to the uncomfortable fact that Boston is invested in corporations facilitating the development of Israeli settlements, which are illegal under international law and give rise to an array of human rights violations on Palestinians. In 2018, the UN Human Rights Office reported on its development of a database of companies engaged in activities linked to these settlements. The report states that business enterprises had directly and indirectly enabled, facilitated, and profited from the construction and growth of these settlements. As a direct result of such engagement, Palestinians suffer from restrictions on freedom of religion, movement, and education, their rights to land and water, access to livelihoods, and their right to an adequate standard of living, their rights to family life, and many other fundamental human rights. It is clear that the activities these corporations are engaged in fundamentally oppose Boston's pledges to support humanity, regardless of its location and its convenience. To preserve Boston's values and uphold its commitment to human rights, the city must divest from companies profiting off of tools of destruction, as well as those contributing to human rights violations in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
It'll come. You just keep talking.
And thank you for sponsoring this important hearing and for your stamina and still being here at this point, Councilors Edwards and O'Malley. My name is Shannon Al-Wakil. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Muslim Justice League. We are a Boston-based organization advocating for human and civil rights that are threatened under national security pretexts. And while we were founded by Muslim women, we work with folks of all backgrounds, various targeted communities, and we believe that while Muslims are a frontline community in targeting under the domestic war on terror, we are certainly not the only one, and we are in many ways sort of a test community for expansion of certain rights abuses. We want to echo all the calls for socially responsible divestment and reinvestment that we've heard today. And in my testimony, briefly, I just want to highlight one particular industry that I hope the council will urge be included in any kind of social responsibility screen, and that is divestment from abusive surveillance technologies. Government regulation of surveillance technologies like facial recognition software and certainly others is far behind the deployment of these technologies, which have already been sold to and are in the hands of many law enforcement departments. And we believe that Boston's public funds are one pressure point that can and should be used to try to push back against the abuses that these technologies can perpetrate. To highlight a few of the likely harms that can be exacerbated by excessive surveillance technology: erosion of due process in the criminal justice system, especially in a racialized manner. Facial recognition technology in particular has been shown to perpetuate human racial biases and to operate against Black folks and people of color in particular. Expanded ability by law enforcement officers who have already, in many cases, been shown to abuse the databases available to them to stalk, intimidate, or otherwise violate the privacy of civilians. And you'll see in our testimony a citation to a report by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I want to highlight that surveillance is not only a racial justice issue, it is a gender justice issue, as much of this surveillance by law enforcement that is outside the bounds of job descriptions does target women for stalking and other harm. Increased ease of persecution by state agencies of dissidents and minority communities, and included among dissidents, of course, whistleblowers who could be tracked with facial recognition software when they are visiting press, for example, or attorneys. Expansion of ICE surveillance capabilities, which could further chill recourse by immigrants to basic services like healthcare services because they know that their movements are being tracked. Endangerment of immigrants, including asylum seekers, should these technologies be hacked by foreign governments, for example, and chilling of First Amendment protected activity, things as simple as attending houses of worship or political protests or union organizing meetings. Studies show that people are more likely to self-censor and restrict their activities when they feel they are being watched, and perhaps that is one aim of this expansive surveillance, is not so much to protect safety, but to enforce conformity and manage dissent. The list is by no means exhaustive, but we just want to highlight the urgency of this matter, that really these technologies are being deployed without adequate regulation, and while there are folks within the tech sector, tech workers, who have courageously spoken out and urged their employers not to sell to law enforcement, for example, they need to be backed up by municipalities across the country, and we hope that Boston will be one of them. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Balaji Lugbegi, and I'm a junior at Boston University. I'm here representing as a campus divestment organizer with Divest BU and former fellow with Better Future Project under 350 Mass. As a member of both, I've been given the opportunity to organize around people who aren't just fighting for a cause, but for their livelihoods. Boston needs to understand that remaining invested in fossil fuels means actively participating in the continued destruction of people everywhere. This had never been a stark reality for me until I went to DC last year with Sunrise Movement and really experienced it. More than 1,000 youth nationwide traveled to Congress, each with their own heartbreaking story about how lives that have been lost in communities that have already fallen in disrepair because of climate change and environmental injustices. In unity we sang, in unity we cried, and in unity we were arrested, all to fight for a chance of a livable future for our generation and the next. We are millions strong all over the world, fighting to address the intersectional problems brought on by climate change, from immigration to starvation. So I know what it means to sit here today trying to understand how a simple decision to invest in our futures has become such a contentious debate. We are at a point where the climate crisis can no longer be addressed by the inaction of bodies of power who are able to contribute to a solution. The city of Boston unremittingly boasts of its progressive green policies, backdropped against the failures of the U.S.'s delay in adopting more sustainable practices. This is shown by the Climate Action Plan and recent Carbon-Free Boston initiative. Yet, help me to understand that the logic that Boston will soon no longer emit carbon into the atmosphere, but still profit from from fossil fuel extraction and privatization elsewhere. We can't pick and choose how we'll save the world today and then tomorrow seek ways to justify our destruction. As people united, we must enumerate our values and live by them in every instance, every time, starting with the divestment decision to divest from fossil fuels and other harmful industries. This is our community, and we wouldn't ask this if we didn't believe it ourselves, that there exists a legitimate way to sustain the community's economic integrity while also protecting our future. Fossil fuels exacerbate the destruction caused by climate change, a problem which has become increasingly a dire intersectional challenge that is impacting local communities. And more often than not, marginalized groups of low income and ethnic minorities are the ones primarily affected. Fossil fuels digress economic growth while contributing to food insecurity, insufficient housing, and racial inequalities. These are the chief reasons I'm out here today, and I hope that in finally divesting, the city can once again build up its profits on values that reflect social responsible and conscientious profit making. Thank you.
Thank you, city councilors and everyone for listening to me. My name is Ebonoluwa Shunubi. I am a senior at New Mission High School, and I am representing the Boston Student Advisory Council, Youth on Board, and the Green Justice Coalition. I was born in Boston, and I love the city I am from. I love the fact that it is commuter friendly, the people are nice and have a sense of community and have pride in where they came from. It is a city that I feel like you can never get tired of, because even though you think you know everything, something new pops up. Boston is growing and changing and is a place I love. But if we want to continue to have the Boston that we love, we must divest our money from fossil fuel corporations. One time I was driving in the car with my cousin and we were behind a bus. It was expelling so much smoke that I thought it was on fire, until my cousin reassured me that the bus probably had just been turned on and needed to run for a while. I was shocked and wondered if this is how every bus is, and we have nearly 1,000 buses running around the city. What damage could this be doing to me, my community, and my family? In September of 2018, I joined the BSAC Environmental Justice Subcommittee. I never thought that I would be involved in environmental justice, but after seeing the impacts pollution and climate change have, and how it does not just affect the environment, but there are bigger things in play, such as institutionalized racism, I just knew that I had to be involved, especially as a youth, because a lot of older people are neglecting this issue because they feel like it won't impact them, but it will impact me, and I have to make a change. I recently learned that a lot of these diseases, such as asthma, can come from living in a bad environment. It had me thinking back to when I was born and hearing stories of how when me and my twin brother were born, I got to go home first, but my brother had to stay in the hospital because he had bad asthma. But thankfully now he's okay and barely has any problems with his asthma. It makes me think what changed, and I strongly believe it was our environment. When we were in my mom's stomach and when we were born, we were living in Roxbury. According to the health report, children in Roxbury have higher rates of asthma than most neighborhoods in Boston. It is one of the most heavily polluted areas in Boston. Then we moved and he got better, and he rarely has any respiratory issues. And since starting my work in environmental justice, I have heard so many stories like mine relating to sickness caused by a polluted environment. The fact that we have ways to put a stop to this destruction and we are not taking advantage of these opportunities is ludicrous. You are giving money to companies that are ruining our future, my future, and slowly killing us all. It is a shame that nowadays you have to dig deep to figure out what is a good neighborhood when wanting to find a home and start a family. Back in the day, people used to look at if a neighborhood had good schools and was safe in terms of like violence. But now, when you think of safe, you have to think, is the environment where I live or send my child to school toxic or hazardous? And it really breaks my heart because those with money will always be okay because they have money to get the resources to save themselves. But it's the minorities that will suffer because they don't have access to the latest technology, resources, and things like that. It is time for the city of Boston to step up and fight for our people because the change that we want to see become the change that we want to see instead of talking about it. This is my future, and we must divest from fossil fuel corporations because I want to live a long life. I don't want my kids to suffer. I don't want to see my city flood due to melting ice caps. I don't want to come back and see my home gone when there are things we can do now. Things like this, we can change. We must divest and stop allowing these companies to play us as fools. These companies use our investments as a way to keep momentum. If we take away the source, the company cannot move. Instead of putting money into these harmful things, we could put it towards something that's more beneficial to the environment. So, city councilors and all listening today, I want to say that this is a big opportunity for Boston to step up and lead a movement that is going to go with or without us. But seizing this moment would be critical, and we need to take it serious. The future may be in your hands, but it's our lives. Please don't throw it away. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you all so much for your testimony. I just wanted to follow up on the iShares comments. So I have a list of some of the separately managed accounts, and so we will follow up to see, but listed under the separately managed accounts is iShares Russell 2000 ETF with a value of about $9,865, and iShares Russell 2000 Value ETF, which is at a value of $11,290. Both are part of, listed as part of commingled funds in a larger group, which
In the separately managed accounts.
in the separately managed accounts, but they are listed as commingled funds. And the first one I mentioned is at $1.5 million, and the second one is at $1.4 million. Again, so I think 9,000 of the 1.5 and 11,000 of the 1.4. Regardless, it's a dollar too many.
Yeah.
And so if it
It's
is,
small, but
and the investment you said were in private prisons specifically, or were they in weaponry or?
No, they're specifically in private prisons. So in like Geo Group and CoreCivic are both in those ETFs.
Thank you.
The two largest private prison companies.
Thank you. And so also forgot to mention, we do know that there is a investment in Raytheon and I believe Smith & Wesson as part of mutual funds as well. So we are doing our due diligence to find out as much as possible.
Yeah, and
Thank you all. Go ahead.
I would also just add one thing, like, we weren't able to take a look at those that are managed under the, like, not the separately managed, because you just frankly just can't see anything. And I would argue that what was cited is probably way undervalued as to what they're actually exposed to. And I have confidence in that, given that they don't feel confident in saying what they're exposed to, because they don't know.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, guys. We're going to go ahead and call up our second, actually there's, I think maybe 3 people who are listed, literally 3 people left, who wanted to publicly testify. I'm going to call up the second panel to come up, but while the second panel is getting situated, I have Randy Mail or Randy Mal. I have Bridget Della Torre, Kay Crockford. And the second panel includes Aaron Tanaka, Alex Papali, Luz Zambrano, Nia Evans, and Lawrence Carty, excuse me. So if the folks who are going to be publicly testifying who signed up can go to the microphones. And I have Randy. Is Randy here? She had to leave, okay. Then I have Bridget Della Torre. Is she here?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Bridget? Are you Bridget? Okay, so you're going to go to the microphone actually over there.
Hi, my name is Bridget. I'm a student at Boston University working on the divestment from fossil fuels campaign. I just wanted to say that as the City of Boston plans to transition its energy sources by 2050 so that it will be the first carbon-free city in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the most energy-efficient state in the nation, it must also account for the carbon emissions produced by the city's pension funds, investments in the fossil fuel industry. It is therefore deceitful to disregard the pollution that city dollars will produce to keep fossil fuel companies in business, especially since the city aims to phase out all carbon emissions. To effectively offset all the fossil fuel emissions attributed to the City of Boston, both the city's energy infrastructure and investment capital need not benefit off the fossil fuel industry. Because there should not have to be a decision between making a profit and the health of our communities, climate justice is needed. The first steps toward justice is for community awareness of our environmental issues, which Governor Charlie Baker took earlier this year when proposing the funding of climate adaptation programs across the state that is to build on the $600 million already invested to mitigate climate change impacts and increase the resiliency of local communities. Governor Baker and his administration acknowledge the urgency of climate change due to human activities causing greenhouse gas emissions, yet city funds still make financial gain from the polluting fossil fuel industry. Behind all the resources the administration has set for climate solutions, divesting our city's pension funds from fossil fuels has still not been considered a viable approach to eliminating further contributions to climate change, despite it being a necessary element of a truly sustainable and climate-prepared municipality. Currently, the city commits social and environmental injustices for a lucrative return on investment that is ultimately causing harm to our health and contributing to global warming by funding the very fossil fuel corporations contaminating our environments. The city can no longer allow fossil fuel companies to devastate the health of our communities and monopolize the way society utilizes energy resources. Boston has demonstrated a commitment to preserving our environment and our future, although needs to continue such commitment by reducing greenhouse gas emission footprints from the city's pension fund investments. This will pose challenges, although with respect to fiduciary responsibilities and objectives, there are numerous well-performing environmental, social, and governance and socially responsible investment indices focusing on the environmental and social impacts of companies, along with targeting fund contracts set to expire and create new guidelines for those companies chosen to invest in. As divestment-demanding Nobel Peace Prize winner Desmond Tutu said, people of conscience need to break their ties with corporations financing the injustice of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we had Katie, I'm sorry. Cade, from the ACLU.
No, yes,
Yeah,
okay.
talk.
Hi, my name is Cade Crockford. I work at the ACLU here in town, just down the street. I haven't heard anybody mention today the fact that GEO Group is heavily invested in immigration detention, private immigrant detention facilities, so I just wanted to raise that as well. That's obviously a huge problem for us. If we're going to consider ourselves a quote-unquote sanctuary city or a Trust Act city, we shouldn't be investing even one penny in that type of private immigration detention. As far as I understand it, that's actually the fastest growing part of those businesses for them, and the federal government actually mandates that a certain number of, I believe it's like 40 or 50,000 beds are maintained by ICE every year, and those beds have to be filled, and that money goes to those types of companies. I also wanted to thank you, Councilor Edwards, for calling this hearing and for the advocates who are doing this really important work. We generally believe at the ACLU that the more democracy we can bring to government, the better. So getting people more involved in the process around how decisions are made about the city's investments, I think, is a really important thing. So we look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, to give credit where credit's due, it's a conversation that happened starting from Yancey, starting from Mel King, continuing on to many generations, including my immediate predecessors and current colleagues, Councilor Matt O'Malley and Michelle Wu. And it's been a collective that came literally from the grassroots, which includes many of the people here in this room and those who had to leave as well. So thank you so much, but this credit also belongs to everyone here. All right, so we're on to the second panel. We've heard from folks discuss divestment. Now we're going to talk about reinvestment, as in where would the money go if we pulled it out. So we're going to, I don't know, again, if you have an organized panel set. All right, take it away.
It'll just go on by itself.
Okay. Good afternoon / early evening. In preparing for this testimony, I reviewed Mayor Walsh's State of the City address in January and was struck by the following passage. We have thrown open the doors of opportunity, and Bostonians are surging through to live their dreams and lead us forward. And because we are drawing on more of our people's strength, the state of our city is stronger than ever. Today, our leadership is needed more than ever. It's a pivotal time in our country. Too many people and too many communities are being left behind. Yet, instead of being called to unify, we're driven further apart. Instead of solutions, we are offered scapegoats. In our democracy that we fought for right here in Boston, that generations of veterans defended with their lives, that civil rights and women's rights marchers risked everything to be part of, is under attack. A government that's supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people, is shut down. The state of our city is strong, but I'm concerned about the state of our union. What happens in Washington, we feel on the streets of Boston. But here's what matters more. What we do in Boston can change the country. We've done it before, and we'll do it again. Because in this time of uncertainty and division, Boston offers a way forward. We are welcoming more voices and expanding our democracy. We are committed to leaving no one behind, and we are not just surviving, we are thriving. And so I thank Chair Siomo, fellow members of the Committee on Ways and Means, Councilor Edwards, Councilor Wu, and Councilor O'Malley for convening us on the important topic of examining how not only Boston's investments, but also Boston's investment process can draw on more of our people's strength, welcome more voices, expand our democracy, leave no one behind, and ensure we are thriving. In a city of firsts, it is with great gratitude and joy that I join this conversation in my capacity as the director of Boston Ujima Project, where I work directly with over 400 members, staff, and partners across Boston to determine the investments that will be made from the Ujima Fund, a $5 million fund that is another first Boston can be proud of, the nation's first democratically governed investment fund. Ujima formed from a drive to respond to Boston's notorious racial health and wealth divide by underwriting our people's strength, directly resourcing what we call our economy builders, our small businesses, our artists, our grassroots organizations. We built a participatory process not just because we believe that democracy is a human right, but also because we believe that meaningful community-based planning will result in a better, more effective allocation of resources. And the effects are multifaceted. Ujima had the chance to present its model in the southern city of Chattanooga, Tennessee. One of the participants, a community elder, reflected on a distinct pattern in years of community engagement that will resonate with Boston's Black, Brown, and Indigenous residents, that certainly resonated with members in my former role as the executive director of the Boston branch of the NAACP, and that is voice but no say. So as we welcome more voices, how do we concretely and substantively honor what they say? Investing in residents who have been most impacted by disinvestment and the racial wealth gap, our close, intimate understandings of provisions in our communities ensures that problems and solutions, needs and supports actually match. You'll hear such solutions and supports from colleagues at Center for Economic Democracy, Green Justice Coalition, Center for Cooperative Development and Solidarity, and the Greater Boston Land Trust Network, our grassroots partners who source ideas directly from community members. An increase in ownership over the process increases ownership of the results. A shared stake compels shared action towards success, thereby allowing our investments more chances to not only make a profit, but also ensure that residents thrive. Ujima is among many local and regional funds profiled in the reinvestment report, which catalogs Ujima and a number of community-based alternatives, including Boston Impact Initiative, Blue Hub Capital, Cooperative Fund of New England, Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, etc. These funds provide real examples for the opportunity to invest directly in assets and businesses which improve the lives of local residents through good jobs, access to housing, and healthy food, models for sustainable energy, and more. Mayor Walsh's morning announcement of the Environmental Social Governance, ESG, investment initiative demonstrates his understanding of the importance of investments geared toward community health. Ujima's community standards, generated by community members, represents deep sustainability, moving beyond just the E in ESG, lifting up the S and the G, directly responding to the city's racial health and wealth divide by ensuring that our money goes to businesses that have Corey-friendly policies, agree to sanctuary business pledges, and limit the highest to lowest paid gap to a 5-to-1 ratio, in addition to ensuring ecologically regenerative practices. It is a participatory process that produced such ambition for deep sustainability. There's a national wave of participatory budgeting, community-led finance, public banking catching on as solutions to the crises of economic inequality and unaccountable top-down decision-making. Boston's own Youth Participatory Budgeting Initiative can count itself as a peer, and Boston can further expand democracy by expanding the participatory budgeting process to all residents and more processes, including reinvestment. We are not only interested in what the city invests in, but also in how this process happens. We are excited to work with the City of Boston to create a process that is directly accountable to the people of Boston, especially those most impacted by the divestment issues we've discussed, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, moving Boston to a state of well-being that can be experienced citywide. Thank you, and you'll hear from Alex Papali next.
Thank you. And you said Ujima's at $5 million in investment fund? And how long has it been around? Formally investing, I guess?
Ujima launched in December 2018. We are now in the fundraising stage. We have not started investing yet, but we expect our first round of investment in July.
Thank you so much for that update.
Good afternoon, Councilor. Looks like you're the last woman standing.
Oh, no. Some are coming back. They had kids to pick up, things like that.
Right on, okay. Okay, well, good afternoon, evening. Thank you for discussing these critically important issues. I'm Alex Papali. I'm with Clean Water Action. We are a member of the Green Justice Coalition, also known as GJC. Together, we represent about over 100,000 members of grassroots community groups, organized labor unions, and environmental organizations like ours all over Massachusetts. As we've been hearing for far too long, a lot of our public funds have been invested in companies, in industries that cause deep damage to our people and our planet. It's no exaggeration to say that this capital stream is part of the lifeblood of a massively corrupt system that dominates our lives, threatens our very survival. We spend a lot of time and resources fighting and trying to recover from its effects, and not much thinking about eradicating root causes or what alternatives could replace it. But as the massive interest in a Green New Deal has shown, that's starting to change, and it's being led by young people around the country and the world. Let me just say that, of course, government's obligation to be fiscally prudent is legitimate and important to the city. However, we are at a critical crossroads. As with apartheid, perhaps more so, this is not a moment to be timid in policymaking. The stakes simply could not be higher. In my line of work, I hear news daily about things like mass chemical poisonings due to lax regulation or utter neglect, or catastrophic drops in insect populations, which now threaten the entire global food chain. The scale of the problem is planetary. Tomorrow, I'm staffing a workshop on climate retreat. People are seriously discussing the likelihood of abandoning large sections of our coastline which is home to millions of people, to sea level rise in the next decade or two. It's imminent if we don't change this thing around. As we've been hearing, many communities are also struggling to survive a tsunami of racist and anti-poor policies and economic and social policies. All this together might seem insurmountable, but there are viable paths forward. In fact, communities that have been most damaged by the status quo are building alternatives themselves, often without media attention or government support or mainstream funding. Consider the Green Justice Coalition's initiative in Chinatown and Chelsea to pilot community-owned and clean energy-based microgrids. These will provide electric power in participating buildings when the utility grid goes down in a climate-driven or other power outage, massively reduce their output of climate pollution, increase community control over this critical resource and infrastructure, potentially reduce energy costs in struggling communities. Or we could take a look at efforts to move Boston to zero waste. There's been a planning process over the last year. This will restructure how we produce, transport, distribute, consume, and dispose of all goods into a circular, sustainable economy. It'll also open up large new green economic sectors centered in Boston and neighboring communities. It'll drive down huge public health and climate impacts of our current linear disposal-based system, and it'll help us educate every household, business, and institution in Boston about its role in driving change. These are just some of the examples of alternatives that are available and viable right now. But they require bold policies and funding to scale up. They're just pilots, and just ideas in a sense. You have a key role to play in steering public dollars into developing these kinds of game-changing new directions for Boston and for and more broadly. I wish your colleagues were here to hear everyone's testimony, but the people are demanding visionary leadership and bold policy decisions. And really the question on the table is, are you going to make the choice to stand with the people, or are you going to get left behind? Because this, like Noah in the last great flood, the ship is sailing.
Before you go, I just wanted to question, did you provide a copy of your testimony, or will you? Because I thought those were excellent ideas, and in as much as you're testifying about these good ideas, we hope to get the testimony here. So, thank you. Luz.
Good afternoon. Hi, Lydia.
Hi.
And, My name is Luz Zambrano, and I am the co-founder and the general coordinator of the Center for Cooperative Development and Solidarity. We support the formation of workers-owned cooperatives. There are businesses that are run by the people that operate in East Boston. East Boston is one of the fastest gentrified neighborhoods in Boston. Over the past year, median rent had been increased for more than 40%. 35% of residents of East Boston that are 5 years old and over speak Spanish, are low-income immigrants. Latino immigrants have come to East Boston for decades, seeking place to live, be safe, work, and raise their families. Unfortunately, Latinos are the most affected right now by the displacement in our neighborhood. As we know, gentrification usually happens to the detriment of the low-income people who are pushed out by wealthier people moving into the area. Developers are more concerned about making a profit than the well-being of people currently living in the neighborhood. Most of us working on this project are immigrant women, head of households, Spanish-speaking, with a lot of limitations in regards to immigration and labor status, but with tremendous resources and energy to make this cooperative work happen. A lot of us in the immigrant community have first-hand knowledge and experience of cooperatives from our respective countries. Also here in the United States, we are already experienced workers in our trades. We clearly see the difference of doing our work in cooperatives rather than as an employees of someone else's business. We will own our labor and profits instead of continuing work for minimum wage while being exploited and suffering from abuses from employers. We see cooperative ownership as a way to gain community capital, create new jobs, and promote decent and livable incomes. And when rooted in low-income communities of color, worker cooperatives also help decrease the racial wealth divide that exists in the city. Cooperatives create an alternative economic system that helps low-income immigrants to make their own pathways out of poverty and stay in the neighborhood that for years they have helped develop and have made their home. Immigrants are tired of being displaced all their lives, first by the global economy that push us out of our homelands, and now happening all over again due to the rapid gentrification of East Boston. Through our cooperative institute and work, immigrants are transforming themselves from powerless residents to powerful members of our community. We see how domestic violence victims come to our training and soon start seeing themselves as not just as survivors, but as leaders of the family and community. Or when they make the decision to use their skills and knowledge for the betterment of the community, not just for themselves. We are currently working with Ujima to learn about how to bring our savings together to finance our cooperatives. But as we learn of the billions of dollars that the city is investing in big corporations that take our money but could care less about our well-being, we start to imagine what our communities could accomplish if our funds were removed from the big banks and returned to local funds and community banks and invest in ourselves. Public dollars should serve the public good. We are starting small and with very limited support, but we know that the city of Boston invests, if the city of Boston invests in cooperatives like is happening in New York, we can do better. The city of New York is supporting and investing in cooperative development. So now poor people, and especially immigrants, are at the vanguard of the totally different economy model that is working for them and for the whole city. We urge the council and the city of Boston to follow their example and reinvest in our community's ability to sustain ourselves and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Councilors Edwards, O'Malley, and Wu, for sponsoring this important hearing. My name is Lawrence Carty, AB Economics, Harvard 93, and I'm on the board of City Life Vida Urbana, one of Boston's leading housing justice
organizations. We work alongside Right to the City and other allies to ensure that all Bostonians have access to affordable housing, because we believe that housing is a human right. I'm testifying about the opportunity to invest our city funds into community land trust. This is a good fiscal strategy for the city to reduce both cost and budgetary risk. Housing is one of the most pressing challenges facing our city and cities around the country. Getting out of the way of new development will not provide the affordable housing that Boston so desperately needs. Think of it this way. Nobody would say that someone buying an economy Ford and someone purchasing a Maserati are buying the same thing. By the same token, we can't meet our city's need for affordable housing by increasing the supply of expensive housing. New luxury condos will not provide homes for working families or prevent gentrification-driven displacement from wiping out ethnic neighborhoods. Instead, Boston can use investments for in-community land trusts to obtain permanent affordable housing. These trusts are a proven ownership model. One local example is the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. Community land trusts are a flexible hybrid form of collective and private home ownership. While homes on the land are privately owned, they are permanently constrained to appreciate at a reasonable rate with inflation. City investments in community land trusts will preserve the quality of life for Boston's working class and simultaneously benefit the city's near-term fiscal bottom line and contribute to long-term fiscal stability. For example, NPR recently did a segment on housing with hard data from a Chicago hospital showing the bottom line fiscal benefits. This hospital pays for housing for homeless patients. The impetus for this was compassion. But after reviewing the data on cost savings, they found an enormous reduction in health costs. The fiscal return from providing housing far exceeded the amount the hospital invested in housing. Furthermore, housing assistance dollars spent on community land trust units will purchase more housing per dollar than if spent in the speculative real estate market. Another risk inherent to the speculative market that community land trusts do not face is budget shortfalls due to price spikes from market bubbles. Community land trusts will also allow Boston to offer a path to first-time home ownership for working families, allowing them to begin building the generational wealth that some of us take for granted. Land trusts can also be integrated into existing neighborhoods, keeping people in their homes and preserving neighborhood cultures. And while we value Boston's architectural heritage, we must equally value the cultural heritage of the people in Boston's neighborhoods. A city investment in community land trusts is an affirmation that people are more important than bricks. Thank you.
Just keep talking.
Yes. Thank you, councilors. My name is Aaron Tanaka. I'm the director of the Center of Economic Democracy and one of the convening members of this network. And I'm very proud and grateful for all of our colleagues, other panelists, and the hard work that's gone into having all of us here. So I want to thank you all in the audience who are hanging in and standing up. We've heard with very clear, urgent moral clarity that we need to take collective action to interrupt this crisis of policing, mass incarceration, ecological collapse, war and occupation, racist housing displacement, amongst the many plagues that most directly impact Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color across the globe, as well as in Boston itself. We've seen very clearly how the lack of transparency exposes the billions of dollars of our hard-earned pension fund dollars, as well as our tax dollars, to be invested in the very causes that our communities are so ardently fighting against every day. And yet, despite the city's history of white supremacy and segregation, we have also been successful in helping pass some of the most progressive policies across the country through the leadership of many people in this chamber and actors in the past in this very room. In our moment of political and economic and cultural crisis, the time clearly calls for a bolder vision and a radical reimagination of the role of public investing. We must start to see security selection as an expression of public will and to be accountable to the well-being of our communities, our families, and the broader living earth. Our colleagues in New York and Oregon have already done this with their municipalities, and it's time for Boston to step into the moment of leadership and quickly and decisively add destruction and death to a no-buy list, removing it from the role of the city of Boston and to preventing our money from going into these causes. But as we divest from the broader old economy where investments are simply made to make a profit at any cost, we also have an opportunity for a new, profound future that is represented by the members of this panel. We have Ujima Boston, who's democratizing control over finance, Green Justice Coalition, building a vision for community-controlled energy and infrastructure, CCDS, redefining the role of labor and ownership, and the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network, articulating a vision and practice for the decommodification of land to ensure permanent affordable housing. Each of these strategies is antidote to Boston's unconscionable wealth divide, a racial wealth divide, and each of these promises offer models for economic development that grow community control and ownership over work, land, and labor. The city of Boston has the opportunity not only to divest from death and destruction, but to reinvest in this new economic future. Shortly, you'll hear from a next panel of finance experts who collectively manage billions of dollars of assets about the fiscal irresponsibility of being invested in Wall Street and the extractive corporations. But even if divestment and reinvestment of our public dollars didn't fully maximize profits at all costs, we have to ask ourselves, what can we truly afford? Boston is a thriving city because of our communities, our workers, our small businesses and institutions. And while we applaud the city's initial step for directing capital towards socially responsible investment, $250 million out of $7 billion is just a drop in the bucket, though an important and meaningful start.
It was 150.
Well, okay.
Sorry.
Even truer. What if the city made a 4-year commitment to shift $1 billion of our extractive Wall Street money into affordable housing, into worker cooperatives, community banks, smaller business lending funds like Ujima, renewable energy infrastructure, and the like? How much stronger of a financial situation would our communities be? How can we create governance structures so that these major decisions are not just at the impulses of a specific administration, but public dollars come under public control? Drawing from principles of economic democracy, we call for a public investment oversight commission like in Portland, a statement of values and ethics, and the exploration of a real participatory mechanism like a municipal public bank to ensure public dollars are being used for the public good in the long term. In our era of crisis, we can't afford short-term conservative fear-based thinking. Are we simply saving for a future that we're actively destroying? But we can afford and we must demand new investments in this collective future. Our families, our communities, our nation, and our earth depend on it. And we invite the City Council and the Mayor's Office to engage with this diverse network of powerful leaders to help democratize our city's finances and grow a people's economy in Boston. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent testimony. And again, I look forward to your continued participation as we schedule working sessions, as we talk about how we can get, how we can truly reinvest in a way that is not only growing our local economy, and I think that's very important for folks to know. This isn't pie-in-the-sky stuff. You are invested, you are working, you're putting people to work in our communities, you are putting our businesses into, you're providing capital to small businesses right now. You are working examples of actually what it means to have a true land trust and developing without displacement. So these are real current examples of social justice enterprises that are thriving. So I want to thank you so much for being here, being present, and bringing those stories. We're going to move on to our third panel. That includes our social investment panel, that is Sada Guess from Trillium, Pat Tomino from Zevin Asset Management, David Schreiber from Greenvest, Maria Egan from Ryanders McVeigh, Lisa Hale from Boston Common Asset Management.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So I'm not sure, again, if you have already an order in which you're planning on speaking. Excellent. So I'll let you take it away.
Thanks. I'll go first. I'm Pat Miguel Camino. I'm the Director of Socially Responsible Investing at a company called Zevin Asset Management. We're based down on Oliver Street. We do socially responsible investment for institutions a bit smaller than the city of Boston, but think of them like religious orders or the endowments of private universities and private schools, and also for individuals here in Boston. So we're a Boston business, and we have a stake today. I have some points on the efficacy and the importance of doing socially responsible investment, but first I want to address some things I heard in the testimony and from the city staff.
Pat, before you go into that,
Yeah.
could you say what your portfolio about?
Yeah, our portfolio is around $500 million.
Thank you.
Yep. So I want to applaud the move today that the city staff announced, but I think the emphasis, I share the view that the focus on the cash investments is just a first step, and it's not in line with what Boston's peer institutions have done. We can take a deeper dive into the pension fund. That's one gap. The pension fund is a gap. I think another gap, I would say, is a specific commitment to socially responsible investing, meaning a guidance document that this council will develop and would provide guidance to the otherwise unaccountable hired staff who reported to you today, and regular public disclosure of the of both the cash investment and the pension fund's holdings. I know that it took some rigmarole to get the information on the holdings that we were issued today, and it should be regular and just set it and forget it in the future. I think that I heard the gentleman from NEPC mention that they seek investments in investment institutions that have signed the Principles for Responsible Investment, the PRI. What you should know, what my colleagues might also highlight, is that that's a first step even for investment institutions. So you give your money to asset managers who've signed the PRI, but it's really hard to tell what they're doing beyond that. They haven't really committed to reaching out to companies in their investing portfolios. They haven't committed to doing a portfolio carbon footprint, and they haven't committed to divesting from private prison companies, one of the low-hanging fruit if you're going to be doing a socially responsible investment policy. So you might push them on that. I think it's great that the city is pairing with Ceres, a really high reputation group, to do shareholder advocacy. So that means, we shouldn't get it confused. Shareholder advocacy doesn't mean screening out harmful industries. It doesn't mean screening out private prison dividers. It doesn't mean screening out companies that make weapons of war. It's kind of an and. It's like, you should build a sustainable portfolio and do shareholder advocacy. And so it's great that you're going to be engaged with that. I think at the same time, we've identified that there are mutual funds that hold private prison stocks and that hold defense companies, and that's where Boston's exposure is. Mm-hmm. You can do activism on those mutual funds as well. You can walk up to iShares, you can walk up to Vanguard, whatever the mutual fund company is, and lean on them and say, what's our exposure? Do you plan to divest? And when the city of Boston is at the table talking to Fidelity Investments, BlackRock, whatever the big Wall Street asset manager is, I guarantee you'll get them to listen. And I'd encourage you to do that. And if it sounds daunting, the gentleman who is seated right here, he can help you with that. You have to, he's someone hired by the staff who are here to basically invest your money. He makes a cut of the total, and he's got to deliver your return, but he's also got to help you enact your values in line with your investment mission and ensure that the city's investments aren't working against its citizens. Mm-hmm. So ask the staff who are here what they're doing to press this gentleman about the value for money he's delivering to the city of Boston. I just have some studies to cite. My two big points are that you should know, I want to reassure you, that socially responsible investing and excluding harmful industries does not hurt portfolio performance. And SRI screens, when you screen out companies, they don't materially constrain the universe of investment options. Where there are constraints, a skilled investment advisor can manage those limitations by creatively finding needed exposure in other subsectors or with alternative investments. And it also helps you seize opportunities to invest in attractive socially responsible companies. I've cited 3 studies, and I'll just put them in the record, I guess. The only other thing I wanted to reassure you about, alongside the stuff I've pointed out based on earlier testimony, is that, you know, it doesn't hurt. In fact, it helps. Number 2 is that SRI can improve performance and risk management in investment portfolios. And that's what New York said when they divested from private prison companies. Their decision was motivated by conviction. They said, we want to align public funds with that city's public values. In a New York Times op-ed, the comptroller of that city, Scott Stringer, he wrote very rightly that the prison industry's turned human suffering into $1 billion business. But here's what he also said, Scott Stringer, the comptroller of the city of New York, financial guy. Private incarceration companies, where we have an indirect exposure in Boston, in addition to being morally suspect, they fail basic risk assessment. Divesting from the private prison industry and the defense industry and the fossil fuel industry means decreasing risk in portfolios. In the case of private prison companies, this is a sector that swings wildly depending on changing federal and state policy in this country. When the DOJ rightly, without constraints in the Obama administration, declared in a report that private prison companies were inhumane, unsafe, and didn't deliver value for money, those stocks plummeted. Now they're riding high for a little while, but where are they going to go in the future? This is an industry, a subsector that you could dump and that you could tell your iShares and mutual fund managers to dump on your behalf. You could at least be in the conversation. So I've taken up a bunch of time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I don't have a question, just wanted to thank you. You can clap for him, it's all right. Lydia and I are less strict on the no clapping rule, particularly for great hearings like this. I wanted to thank you all. I really wanted to stay till the end. Unfortunately, I have a commitment in West Roxbury at 6 o'clock, so I have to leave now, and I'll probably be late for it. But really wanted to thank all of you, and particularly my partners, Lydia and Michelle, for their great work on this. You know, we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I think it's a little discouraging how the state mass general laws can hinder what we want to do, but we've done it before, and we can absolutely do it again. So I wanted to thank all of you who are here, my dear constituents and friends, and have a great evening. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards, for hanging in with us, and thank you to everyone else. We've all submitted written testimony, so I hope that your colleagues will have an opportunity to review that. I would echo, some of Pat's comments regarding, Mr. Manning's comments earlier from NEPC. There's a really easy fallback to say we're in commingled funds, we can't do anything. When you're managing $5 billion, or you're bringing $5 billion to asset managers, looking for them to deploy that capital for you, paying them to deploy that capital for you, you'd be amazing at how open they are to having a conversation with you about the intricacies of the investments, particularly when we're looking at things like private prisons, when it's 2 companies that are fundamentally terrible business models. You can be the lever for change because you have the power of the person, because it's large dollars that the pension is investing. My name is Seda Geis. I'm an investment manager at Trillium Asset Management, which is a Boston-based, employee-owned benefits corporation that's managing over $2.5 billion in assets for a diverse group of investors, institutional and individual. Our investment approach fully incorporates environmental social governance, ESG, as we've used the acronym all day, considerations both through exclusions of companies that are in industries that are high risk, have high risks associated with these various factors, as well as seeking to identify companies that are mitigating these ESG risks and taking advantage of material opportunities. We believe that by integrating material ESG factors into the investment process, we are able to identify better managed companies that are positioned to perform well in the long term. We have a forward-looking view on investment in companies rather than rear view. And I think that is an important part. And we've been integrating these types of considerations into portfolio construction since we were founded 35 years ago. So there's a data set there that proves that you can do this style of investing. In my lengthier written testimony, I cite a lot of research and studies and academic data that supports what Pat said as well, and that's that ESG integration does not require you to sacrifice return, and it does not make your investments more risky. There's actually strong data to say that it is a risk mitigation tool in your portfolio, which feels pretty intuitive, right? A company that's in the business of detaining people and is expanding in their growth area is immigrant in detention, is likely really exposed to legislative risk, to reputational risk, to legal, right, litigation risk. I would say, as an accredited investment fiduciary and someone that works in, has historically worked in the capacity as Mr. Manning at NEPC in a consulting role and working with folks that are managing pools of investments for retirees, I understand that your role as a fiduciary is one that's serious, and that optimization of return and that strict management of risk is really integral to that work. And I think I would just echo what Mr. Macy said, is that it's, yes, we can go back and we can change the rules through the legislative process, but it's also an interpretation of those rules that's the dynamic that's at play. The Department of Labor has given us some guidance on how we think about that for ERISA plans, so private sector retirement plans, right? So in October of 2015, then Secretary of Labor Tom Perez addressed the ESG integration by rescinding a 2008 bulletin from the Department of Labor that discouraged the consideration of these factors in the evaluation of companies. Further, in December of 2016, they issued a bulletin on shareholder rights, recognizing the importance of proxy voting and fiduciaries engaging portfolio companies on ESG matters, so the work that you're now undertaking with Ceres. And while more recent field bulletins from lower authorities within the DOL and this new administration have tried to kind of narrow those earlier bulletins, we don't argue with the central position, and that's similar to the position in PARAC, which is that, to quote the DOL language, because every investment necessarily causes a plan to forgo other investment opportunities, plan fiduciaries are not permitted to sacrifice investment return or take on additional investment risk as a means of using plan investments to promote collateral social policy goals. While I think you should think of social policy goals, the research we've referenced, the 35 years plus that we've been doing this investment, the 30 years plus my fellow panelists have been doing this work, shows that you can absolutely invest in this way, not increase risk, not reduce performance, and meet your fiduciary goal, and I would say amplify your fiduciary responsibility in the management of the portfolios. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Hales, and I just want to say thank you, Councillor Edwards, and thank you to everyone who's still here and bringing us home. I echo the comments of my colleagues. I'm going to try not to be repetitive, but what I will say is I'm a principal at Boston Common Asset Management. It's a globally focused sustainable investment firm that manages $2.4 billion in assets for institutions and individuals. I also happen to be a board member for the Boston Impact Initiative, which is a place-based loan fund focused on economic justice. So I have a personal and a professional interest in investments that are holistic and focused on the full range of impacts that they can have, both good and ill. And I think that's, we as an investment firm are dedicated to generating financial returns and meaningful improvements in corporate performance on an environmental, social, and governance basis. Those two things are not contradictory. In fact, they're, I believe, essential to ensuring prosperity and performance from the companies that we invest in. Markets depend on transparency. Information moves markets. And if the information that investors receive is shallow and short-term, then the investment decisions that both companies and investors make are going to be shallow and short-term. And that short-term thinking by investors and companies results in negative externalities like carbon pollution and the other things that we've talked about here today. So what I'm trying to say is truly integrated thinking, thinking about all the impacts that companies have, which unfortunately is not common yet throughout the investment and finance markets. That's the common practice of sustainable investment firms like my peers here with me at the table, but we represent a very small niche amongst the vast majority of investment firms out there. So really taking the broadest range of impacts into account when we're trying to build portfolios, we believe is necessary in order to ensure that both the sustainability from a financial perspective and from an environmental, social, and governance perspective. That's our philosophy, if you like. So I'm supposed to talk about how there's this huge demand and that environmental, social, and governance investing is now mainstream and everybody's doing it. What I would say is that though there's been a huge uptick in the number of funds and products that have been launched, I would maintain that the sustainable, those approaches which are really integrating ESG, and this is self-serving, so let me be frank, that are doing shareholder advocacy to move corporations to improve the quality of companies in our portfolios by engaging with them, is still a relatively small number of firms that are really focused on that. That doesn't mean that you can't, as my colleagues have said, influence your investment managers right now to improve their practices by asking them some questions about what they're invested in and how they can report back to you on how they're moving towards a policy. For example, establishing a policy and expecting them to report to you what they're invested in that doesn't comply with your policy and what their strategy is and the timeline for divesting from that. That I would love to see the city adopt. I think the other point I wanted to make was around leadership. So right now, we all know that we're not seeing a lot of leadership out of Washington on any of these issues. So there's a gap and an opening for both the state and municipal leadership to step up. And we've seen examples in other states and other municipalities addressing these issues, holding votes around prison divestment, around a range of issues, and also adopting more wholesale policies around the integration of environmental, social, and governance factors. So there's examples out there, there's practices that can be shared and hopefully elevated. The folks here are expert that you can rely on if you need assistance and support. And yeah, the final point I would say is that the narrowness of most investment management, the unwillingness to look at these factors is, it results as, it comes about because of the way they're trained and taught to think about how investments work. ESG is a challenge to that frame. That is why you get kind of relative reluctance from many investment professionals to respond positively or enthusiastically to these requests. And so you have to be prepared for pushback. I guess this is my warning, and yeah, I want to gird you for this, that this is going to be a bit of a battle in terms of moving this. But that you have allies both within the investment community and in the activist community who want to support this work. So thank you.
So my name is Maria Egan. I'm a portfolio manager at Fresh Pond Capital, which is a division of Reinders McVeigh Capital Management and Reinders McVeigh Capital Management, the parent company. We manage $1.6 billion in assets and advise on another $6 billion in assets. And so I'm not going to echo what my colleagues have said about SRI and ESG. It's all very true. The main point that I wanted to make today was just about transparency and how it can be a tool to actually strengthen accountability in management. And so we've gotten some insight into how transparent, beyond just the reporting that gets put out today from hearing the different panelists. But, the first point within that is just transparency around the process. So, we see the investment policy statement, we get the proxy voting guidelines, but just understanding more about how those are created and how they're shifted over time. It was mentioned that the pension has implemented a ESG scale of 1 to 4, so just understanding what goes into that. Are they actually letting the investment managers know what their scale is? So how in-depth that process is. That's the first point. The second is further transparency with reporting. So, I see that the pension releases an annual report. It's quite extensive. There's also quarterly reporting that comes out. And, it's audited by a auditing firm, which is great. But really what's missing from that is a full list of all of the holdings. So, we saw the list that was released to us, but with those commingled assets, just really understanding a deeper dive of what's underneath those. And as Seda mentioned, as the investor that's giving these managers the money, that's their responsibility to give that back to you. Also transparency around fees and performance net of fees, not necessarily gross of fees, just gives you a little further information into how the actual performance and growth of these assets is doing over time. So the third point is really to understand where the risk is. So this transparency leads to understanding where the risks are, and we all believe that ESG metrics and investing in a socially responsible way actually is the highest fiduciary standard, and it helps you mitigate risks that traditional finance investors might not be looking at. So really just holding all the 176 managers in the pension fund accountable for that, and will just, we believe, lead to longer term success. I have to give a little plug that we're lucky to live in the state where, and city where values matter. Massachusetts doesn't have any private prisons in our state, so we just shouldn't be investing in them, and it seems like that is one of the key takeaways from today. And yeah, in closing, thanks for having us. I'm proud to live and work here, and I'm excited to see the city take steps to move this forward.
Thank you. So I have some collective questions that whoever wants to answer can answer them. So I think I'm not familiar with all of your companies. I'm kind of familiar, but so. And in as much as you're here to discuss, that it's there's a third way, if you will, like there's another way of thinking about investment, another way of thinking about how to grow money in this capitalist structure that we're still operating in. At least do this, is what I'm understanding, and you will not be hurt if you do this. So I'm curious, with the examples that we had already in the panel before you, how many of you or your investment funds are invested in similar endeavors, in similar land trusts? Are you invested in cooperatives? Are you invested in this Co-op Fund of New England or community banks? I mean, tell me about, if we're speaking as leadership and ways in which it can be done. Are you also part of that conversation? Do any of your portfolios include those companies, or will they include those companies?
So I would probably say it's across the board, yes. But so yes, I would say that it depends on the client's investment policy, and similar, there's guidelines around what investments are available and what the return expectations are for the portfolio. But we have a significant exposure to community development financial institutions and microfinance institutions across the country, but specifically because we have a large client base in New England area, working with many of the organizations, Blue Hub is one that was mentioned, I think, in the earlier panel, Coastal Enterprises in Maine, Cooperative Fund of New England. And so we facilitate direct promissory note lending to those different organizations. We've also worked on supporting non-public companies that have, I think, much better business models around shared ownership and employee compensation, employee ownership of the companies, those types of things. So through direct investments or investments in private funds. It's a small part, I'll be honest, of our business. But it is an important part and one that we have been growing and thinking about in a very constructive way and how we can support Ujima and Boston Impact initiatives in this growing field.
We regrettably should do more. Regrettably, we have not been doing as much as some of the other firms. We're a smaller shop, so we focus on public equity strategies, investing in stocks on behalf of our clients. And we don't have someone on staff who does due diligence on private deals and other stuff like that. So we focused on the SRI side and the equities portfolio, and we're proud to have been one of the first companies to divest from private prison companies to issue an official policy statement. And the really great development is that the firms in Boston in the SRI field have, we've all done that. And it's a way in which our cohort is putting pressure on the wider financial industry on an issue that was really not on the radar 10 years ago.
I would just add that we also do a lot of this kind of out of the stock market investing. And, of the 176 managers in the pension, there are 100 private equity managers that are, I don't know the exact composition of them because a lot of that information is not public. But I'm sure that some of those are doing private investing, and there certainly would be room in the entire pension, looking at the risk return profiles for these types of investments.
Yeah, and my firm, we actually specialize in international investing. So the majority of our assets are invested outside of the U.S. So we do invest in kind of microfinance funds and other types of community-driven or vehicles in the international markets, but we don't have anything like that equivalent here in the U.S.
Okay, well, this report that we got, and I've seen before, lists a lot of the endeavors that are actually really good examples or opportunities for investment in the cooperative space, in the shared economy. And I only bring that up because I feel you are who we're going to look to in a lot of our conversations about how it can be done. And so if you're not doing it, or if you're not part of that conversation and showing it can be done, then we don't have an example. It's harder for us at the City Council to push that narrative. So I'll hold the same report up to our consultant as well and say, have you even bothered to look at this as well? So I just wanted to be consistent with, when it comes to investments and conversations and the examples that we choose to have. Another question I had, and I think it's great to emphasize, again, having SRI standards do not hurt portfolios. They can help them. But tell me about when that's where we're going to put our money. But when it comes to, and I don't know, when it comes to divesting the money, as in the process of moving from one to another, how does that impact portfolios, that process of divestment? And I bring that up because I was very struck by the amount of retirees we have in Boston. What did he say? It was almost $51 million a month that we put out to make sure that they live with dignity, having worked for years for the city of Boston. It's completely something I support. So now we are going to ask one day for them to move this money. And so that movement is something I'm curious about how that works and how that helps or hurts returns on investment. Anyone?
So I'd start off by saying your returns are likely mostly driven by the asset classes that you are invested in. And you're going to be invested in public equities, various sizes of equities, in private equity, and maybe alternative assets of different types. There'll be a range of asset classes, and so divestment will look different there is less transparency in some of those asset classes than others, as we've discovered during the discussion today. So in some of those asset classes, you don't really know what you're investing in, to be frank. The manager puts together a package, and based on their previous track record, they're able to convince any PC who's done the research on them that this is a great opportunity. We're going to allocate X amount of dollars to our clients. But to answer your question, what I would say is that in our experience, divestment from fossil fuels, we've never invested in private prisons. So it has had no impact whatsoever on our investment performance. We have run strategies that divested or have been divested from fossil fuels for over a decade. And what we would typically say is that we take a different path, but we get to the same goal.
So you can plan then for the
So for example, when
investment.
energy stocks do well, then if you don't have exposure to energy, fossil fuels, then your portfolio may lag a bit, or that portion of your portfolio that is invested in those types in the public equity markets may lag. But we expect energy is cyclical, so it goes up and down. And it's actually a shrinking proportion of the investable market. It used to be 10% here in the US, now it's about 5%. Conventional energy, I should say. That doesn't include renewables. Which are actually classified as technology often, because they're different types of companies than, right? A solar power company is very different from an oil and gas company.
I'm going to answer in a little different way. So if you're just talking about nuts and bolts cost of like sell this, buy this, when you're looking at mutual fund commingled funds, the ones that they kind of point to where they don't have the look through into the underlying investments, switching from one of those funds to another fund that better reflects your values as a city and the investment you're looking to do really should have no cost friction. You know, you're buying at the net asset value, meaning at the value of the underlying positions, you're selling it over here at this, and you're buying over here, and you can do that on the same day. There's no tax impact. You're not a taxable entity. On the private investments, it's a longer process, right? Because if you said tomorrow we want to divest, we're selling everything, you have to find a buyer. You might have to take a lesser price for that investment. So I think there's room for a plan for divestment that says, you know, public equity mutual funds, it's a no-brainer. That's a one and done. You can do that with no cost. You know, individual names, maybe a little trading cost, you know, a penny a share. On the privates, it might take a longer, you know, period of time to get out of those investments if you deem them inappropriate with your current policy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We've heard a lot about the setting of a time frame or a deadline as sort of a stall tactic, but in fact, this is a managed process, divestment, that you set to take place in stages over a reasonable period of time, and that's the way that any of these asset owners who've chosen to divest either from fossil fuels or from provisions have done it. In fact, a Boston area institution, the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Unitarian Church across the country, in accordance with a resolution they got from their believers, was required to divest in a managed way from fossil fuels. They actually came up with a really great solution where they said, we're going to divest except where we are deeply engaged in productive activism with oil companies. And if we're getting wins, then we'll stay in as long as we keep getting wins, and if not, we're going to sell. And that's a process that's being managed by a committee which I'm on, the Socially Responsible Investing Committee of the Unitarian Faith. And it's being aided very ably by, in fact, NEPC. So the firm that works for you on your investment side is helping the Unitarian Church divest from fossil fuels in a really thoughtful way and managing that process for them. So it's, I think, a fertile area to pursue.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add, I was going to mention that New York City, their divestment from fossil fuel reserves is going to take place over the next several years. They've set 2022 as their deadline. So they have a time frame over which time they are planning to do that.
And just to add before you, were you going to?
I'm good.
So New York City, the mayor actually submitted some written testimony in behalf of, to this committee, and that'll be available on record as well, just noting also their own process and expressing solidarity for Boston considering and also potentially divesting from fossil fuels. So that speaks to Mayor de Blasio. I'll give him a shout out, but thank you so much for that. We've not, since, in the year and some odd months I've been here, I've not had another mayor outside of Massachusetts come in and say, by the way, yeah, awesome job, Boston. So thank you for that, New York. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude. It's been a long day, and I want to thank everyone for sticking through all of this. I do want you to understand, and I really do hope that you're in it for the long haul in this conversation, because you're right, there is headwind, right? And there is a resistance to change because of the fear of what could happen to the many retirees. Again, 681 every year are leaving the city of Boston and going into retirement, and they rightfully deserve guaranteed understanding that the money that they put into for years, they will be able to get back. And I can assure I won't miss my loan payments, so they can also get some of that from my student loan debt. But for now, we want to just make sure that we understand the fiduciary responsibility that we have to City of Boston employees. We take that very seriously. That being said, if there's a better future to invest in, hoping you'll be at the conversations, most likely in working sessions, where we really talk nuts and bolts, setting up the guidelines and screening mechanisms that can be used. Who could be using them? As I mentioned, you mentioned the consultants. There's certain leverages and certain positions of power that we may not know, but you know as investors, where this person can be doing this screen right away, whether the state law does or doesn't do this. So that was a great points and examples. So thank you so much for coming out here. Thank you to the other panelists as well. So with that, unless there's someone who has a dying public comment to say, I am going to go ahead and close out the hearing tonight. Thank you.